One second, Eliza Crow was just another exhausted woman stepping off a wagon into a frontier town that didn't want her. The next, her hand connected with a man's face, hard enough to silence an entire street. That single moment of rage would lead her up a mountain, into the arms of a stranger who needed a wife but didn't know how to want one, and straight into the crosshairs of a man powerful enough to bend the law itself. But before any of that, before the blood, the avalanche, the reckoning, there was just the slap. Stay until the end to see how a woman who had nothing became the one thing no man could control. Drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The wagon hit another rut, and Eliza's head cracked against the wooden side rail hard enough to make her vision swim. She didn't cry out. Hadn't cried out for the last 3 days of this godforsaken journey, and she wasn't about to start now. "Red Hollow, 10 minutes!" the driver shouted back, his voice competing with the rattle of wheels over rock. 10 minutes until her new life. Or what was supposed to pass for one. Eliza shifted on the hard bench, her dress stiff with trail dust, her hands raw where the reins had bitten during her turn driving 2 days back. The other passengers, a miner with a cough that sounded like death, a merchant's wife who'd stopped speaking to anyone after Topeka, and a young man who might have been a preacher or might have been running from something, hadn't looked at her in hours. That was fine. She hadn't come here to make friends. Through the gap in this canvas cover, she caught her first glimpse of Red Hollow. It wasn't much. A main street of packed dirt, buildings that looked like they'd been thrown up in a hurry and left to settle crooked, and people moving with the kind of purpose that said survival mattered more than comfort. She'd seen worse. Hell, she'd lived worse. The wagon lurched to a stop in front of what might generously be called a town square, really just a wider part of the street with a water trough and a post where horses were tied. The driver climbed down with the grace of a man who'd made this run too many times to care about appearances. "Red Hollow," he called out, unnecessarily. "End of the line for some of you." Eliza waited for the others to disembark first. The miner practically fell out, catching himself on the wheel. The merchant's wife stepped down with her skirts gathered high, her face a mask of disgust at the mud. The young man, definitely running from something, disappeared into the crowd before Eliza could blink. Then it was her turn. She took the driver's offered hand because refusing it would have been stupid, not because she needed it. Her boots hit the ground with a solid thunk, and for a moment she just stood there, letting the mountain air fill her lungs. It was thinner up here, colder, even in late summer. "You the mail-order bride?" a voice asked. Eliza turned to find a man watching her from the shadow of the general store's overhang. He was maybe 40, with the kind of belly that said he ate better than most folks in town, and the kind of smile that made her skin crawl. "I'm Eliza Crow," she said, keeping her voice level. "That ain't what I asked." He stepped into the sunlight, and 3 other men materialized behind him like he'd conjured them. "Asked if you're the woman some fool ordered up for his mountain hideaway." The crowd that had been moving with purpose a minute ago slowed. Not stopping exactly, but definitely paying attention now. "Who's asking?" Eliza said. "Name's Pritchard. I run the saloon, the store, and most everything else worth running in Red Hollow." He looked her up and down in a way that made her want to check if her buttons were still fastened. Just curious what kind of woman answers an ad like that. Must be desperate. Or damaged. One of the men behind him laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. Eliza felt the heat rise in her chest, the same heat that had gotten her in trouble before, the same heat she'd promised herself she'd keep locked down out here. But there was something about the way Pritchard stood there, so sure of himself, so certain she'd take it, because what choice did a woman alone have? "Must be a lonely kind of man," she said quietly, "who spends his afternoon insulting women he doesn't know." Pritchard's smile didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. "That mouth's going to get you in trouble, girl." Wouldn't be the first time. "Gideon know what he's getting?" "I imagine he'll figure it out." Pritchard took a step closer. Close enough that she could smell whiskey on his breath, even though it wasn't yet noon. "See, that's the thing about Gideon Hale. Man's been up on that mountain so long he's forgotten how things work down here. Forgotten you got to break a woman proper before she's any use." The heat in Eliza's chest turned into something white and sharp. "Step back," she said. Or what? Pritchard reached out like he was going to touch her face, like he had every right in the world. Eliza's hand moved before her brain caught up with it. The slap connected with the meat of his cheek hard enough that the crack echoed off the false fronts of the buildings. Hard enough that Pritchard staggered back a step, his hand flying to his face. Hard enough that the entire street went dead silent. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Then Pritchard's face twisted into something ugly, and the men behind him shifted forward like dogs waiting for a command. "You stupid, that's enough." The voice came from behind Eliza, low and rough, like it didn't get used much. She turned and found herself looking at a man who seemed to be made entirely of hard angles and old leather. He was tall, taller than Pritchard by half a head, and lean in the way of someone who worked for everything he ate. His face was weathered, his beard more gray than black, and his eyes were the pale blue of winter ice. Gideon Hale. Had to be. "This your problem now, Gideon?" Pritchard said, but there was something careful in his voice that hadn't been there before. "She's standing in front of me," Gideon said. "That makes her my concern. Your concern just struck me. Saw that, also saw what you were about to do." Gideon's hand rested on his belt, not on the knife there, but close enough. "We calling the sheriff, or we moving on with our day?" Pritchard worked his jaw like he was chewing on his next words. The crowd had started to drift away. Not far, but enough to give the illusion of privacy. Finally, he spat in the dirt and stepped back. "Your funerals," he said, then looked at Eliza. "Literally, maybe." He turned and walked toward the saloon, his men following. But before he disappeared inside, he looked back once. The promise in that look was clear enough. Eliza's heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth, but she kept her face still, kept her breathing even. When she finally looked up at Gideon Hale, she found him studying her with an expression she couldn't read. "You Eliza Crow?" he asked. "Yes." "You always that quick to violence?" "Only when someone reaches for me without asking." Something that might have been amusement flickered across his face, but it was gone before she could be sure. "Fair enough. You got belongings?" "One trunk. On the wagon." Gideon moved past her without another word, lifting her trunk like it weighed nothing and settling it on his shoulder. He started walking toward the edge of town, and for a moment Eliza just stood there, watching him go. This was it then. The moment where she could still turn around, still get back on that wagon when it headed out tomorrow. Still run like she'd been running for 3 months, but there was nowhere left to run to. She followed. The walk through town took maybe 5 minutes, but it felt longer with every pair of eyes that tracked their progress. Gideon didn't seem to notice or care. He walked with the steady pace of a man who'd made this trip 100 times and expected to make it 100 more. At the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to scrub pine and the road turned into a trail, a mule waited. It was gray, patient, and looked about as interested in conversation as its owner. Gideon strapped the trunk onto the mule's back with practiced efficiency, then turned to look at the mountain rising behind Red Hollow. It wasn't the tallest peak Eliza had ever seen, but it was close enough to make her neck ache when she tried to see the top. "That where we're going?" she asked. "Yes." "How far?" "Half a day if we move steady, longer if we don't." Eliza looked down at her boots. Good leather, but made for city streets, not mountain trails. "I'll move steady." Gideon gave her another one of those long looks, like he was trying to see through her skin to whatever was underneath. Then he started walking. The first hour wasn't bad. The trail was clear, the incline gentle, and Eliza's legs remembered what it was like to walk with purpose. She kept pace behind Gideon, the mule between them, and tried not to think about what she'd just done back in town. Tried not to think about the look on Pritchard's face or the way violence had come so easily to her hand. The second hour was harder. The trail got steeper, the air got thinner, and Eliza's lungs started to burn. She didn't complain, didn't ask to stop, but when Gideon finally called a halt near a stream, she almost wept with relief. "Drink," he said, nodding toward the water. "Then we keep moving." Eliza knelt by the stream and cupped water to her mouth. It was cold enough to make her teeth ache, clean enough that she could see the rocks on the bottom. When she'd drunk her fill, she sat back on her heels and found Gideon watching her again. "You going to stare at me the whole way up?" she asked. "Trying to figure you out." "What's to figure?" "Whether you're going to make it." Eliza stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. "I'll make it." "That what you told yourself when you answered my ad?" "Among other things." Gideon was quiet for a moment, then, Why'd you answer it? Why'd you place it? Asked you first. Eliza considered lying, considered giving him some soft story about seeking adventure or wanting a fresh start, but there'd already been enough lies between them. His ad had been sparse to the point of brutal honesty, and hers in return hadn't been much better. Because I needed to disappear, she said, and your mountain seemed far enough away. Gideon nodded slowly, like that made perfect sense to him. Fair enough. Let's go. The third hour broke something inside her. Not her will, that stayed stubborn and intact, but something in her legs or lungs or both decided they'd had enough. The trail had gone from steep to nearly vertical, switchbacking up the mountainside in a series of cuts that made her calves scream. The air was so thin now that every breath felt like she was trying to pull water through a reed. Gideon hadn't slowed, hadn't looked back, just kept that same steady pace like gravity was a suggestion rather than a law. Eliza's boot caught on a root and she went down hard on her hands and knees, rocks biting into her palms. She stayed there for a moment, head hanging, watching her blood drip onto the trail dust. The mule stopped. Then, after a longer pause, Gideon's boots appeared in her field of vision. You hurt? He asked. No. You bleeding? Noticed that. Can you walk? Eliza pushed herself upright, swaying slightly. Yes. Then walk. He started moving again, and something hot and bitter rose in Eliza's throat. Not tears. She'd cried those out months ago. Just rage at her own weakness, at her body's refusal to keep up with her will. But she walked. The fourth hour was a blank space in her memory. She knew she must have kept moving because eventually the trail leveled out slightly and the trees changed from scrub pine to something darker and fuller. She knew Gideon must have stopped at least once more for water because her throat wasn't completely raw. But the details were gone, burned away by the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other. When Gideon finally stopped for real, the sun was starting to dip toward the western peaks, painting everything in shades of gold and shadow. There, he said, pointing. Eliza lifted her head and saw the cabin. It wasn't much. A single-room structure built from logs that had weathered to gray, with a stone chimney and a roof that might have been shake shingles once upon a time. There was a small porch, a door that hung slightly crooked, and one window with glass that caught the last of the daylight. But it was solid, it was standing, and it was apparently home. Welcome to it, Gideon said, and started down the final stretch of trail. Inside, the cabin was exactly what Eliza had expected. One room dominated by a stone fireplace, a table with 2 chairs, a bed in one corner that looked like it had been built by someone who knew wood but didn't care much about comfort, and shelves stacked with supplies. Everything was clean in the way of places where cleanliness was a survival strategy rather than a luxury. Gideon set her trunk down by the door and started building a fire without preamble. Eliza stood in the middle of the room, her legs still shaking, and tried to figure out what she was supposed to do now. There's coffee in the tin on the second shelf, Gideon said without turning around, and beans in the crock if you're hungry. Where do I... Eliza started, then stopped. Where did she sleep? Where did she wash? What were the rules here? Gideon seemed to hear the unfinished question. You take the bed. I'll sleep outside until we figure things out. Outside? Got a spot under the overhang. Won't be the first time. That's not... It's how it is. He got the fire going and stood, brushing his hands on his pants. Water's from the pump out back. Outhouse is 20 paces north. Don't go wandering at night. There's cats up here that'll take you for prey if you're stupid about it. Cats? Mountain lions. Also bears, though they're mostly lower down this time of year. He moved to the door like he was about to leave, then paused. You did good today. Getting up here. Most women wouldn't have made it. Before Eliza could respond, he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft click. She stood there for a long moment, listening to her heart gradually slow to something like normal. Then she sank onto one of the chairs and let her head fall into her hands. 3 months ago, she'd been in Philadelphia. She'd had a job, a room in a boarding house, and something that almost resembled a plan for her life. Then Victor Halbrook had noticed her, and everything had gone to hell in a manner so swift and complete it still didn't feel real. Victor Halbrook, railroad man, investor, friend to senators and judges. A man who decided he wanted something and believed the world would bend to give it to him. He'd been charming at first. Gifts, invitations to dinners she couldn't afford to attend otherwise. She'd been flattered, then wary, then frightened when she realized his interest wasn't the kind that accepted refusal. When she'd tried to leave Philadelphia, she discovered he'd already spoken to her landlord, her employer, even the minister at her church. Everywhere she turned, his influence had gotten there first, so she'd run, truly run, in the middle of the night with nothing but what she could carry. She'd worked her way west, doing whatever job she could find, staying just ahead of the letters that seemed to follow her. Letters that came from lawyers, from private agents, all carrying the same message. Mr. Halbrook wished to speak with her. Mr. Halbrook was concerned for her welfare. Mr. Halbrook had legal matters to discuss. The last letter had been waiting for her in Denver, and it had been different, more direct. It had referenced a contract she'd supposedly signed, a debt she supposedly owed. All lies, but lies backed by enough legal language to make them dangerous. That's when she'd seen Gideon's ad in the back of a month-old newspaper. Wanted, wife. Must be strong, capable, and willing to live rough. No prior attachments, mountain living, serious inquiries only. She'd written back that same day. 3 weeks later, she was on a wagon heading to Red Hollow. And now she was here, on a mountain so remote it didn't even have a name on most maps, with a man she'd known for all of 6 hours. The fire crackled. Outside, she heard Gideon moving around, talking quietly to the mule. Normal sounds, domestic sounds. She'd bought herself time, maybe even safety. But as she looked at her bleeding palms in the firelight, Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just traded one prison for another. She was wrong about that, but she wouldn't know it for weeks yet. The first morning, Eliza woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of an axe biting wood. For a moment, she couldn't place where she was. The bed was harder than anything she'd slept on in years. The air was cold enough to make her nose ache, and the light coming through the window was all wrong, too clear, too sharp. Then memory caught up with her body. The mountain, the cabin, Gideon. She sat up, wincing at the protest from every muscle in her legs, and found a cup of coffee steaming on the table. Next to it was a plate with bread and what looked like dried meat. Beyond the window, Gideon was working through a pile of logs with steady, economical swings. Eliza pulled on her boots, barely, because her feet had swollen overnight, and made her way to the table. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, but it was hot, and it was there, and she drank it gratefully. By the time she'd finished eating, Gideon had stopped chopping and was stacking the split wood against the side of the cabin. She watched him work through the window, noting the way he moved. Nothing wasted, nothing rushed. Like he'd learned a long time ago that efficiency mattered more than speed. When he came inside, she'd already washed the dishes and was trying to figure out where things went. "Second shelf," he said, nodding at the cup in her hand. "Plates below." Eliza put them away, acutely aware of him standing in the doorway, taking up space. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. "Today? Rest. You're no good to anyone if you can't walk." "I can walk." "You can barely stand. Saw you favoring your left leg." Eliza's pride bristled, but he wasn't wrong. "Tomorrow, then." "Tomorrow you learn where things are. Water, wood, how the stove works." He paused. "You know how to shoot?" "No." "Can you learn?" "I can learn anything if someone teaches me." Something almost like approval crossed his face. "We'll start tomorrow. For now, stay close to the cabin. Don't go past the tree line." "Because of the cats?" "Because you don't know the land yet. Easy to get turned around up here." He left again after that, this time heading up the mountain with a rifle slung over his shoulder. Hunting, she assumed, or checking traps. She didn't ask. The day stretched out long and strange. Eliza explored the cabin, learning its corners and rhythms. She found Gideon's supplies meticulously organized, dried goods in one area, tools in another, ammunition stored separately. Everything had a place, and everything was maintained with the kind of care that spoke of isolation. When you couldn't just walk to a store and buy a replacement, you took care of what you had. She found books too, which surprised her. Not many, but they'd been read enough that the spines were cracked and the pages soft. Poetry, mostly. Some philosophy. A guide to mountain plants that was stuffed with dried specimens and notes in Gideon's cramped handwriting. Not what she'd expected from a man who spoke in sentences of 5 words or less. By the time he returned at dusk, she'd managed to get the stove going and had water heating. He looked at the fire, then at her, and nodded. "Good," he said. It was, she'd learn, one of his highest compliments. The next week passed in a rhythm that was both strange and oddly comforting. Gideon would wake before dawn and make coffee. Eliza would join him as the sun came up, and they'd eat in silence while the mountain turned from gray to gold around them. Then he'd give her a task, learn to work the pump, practice splitting kindling, understand how to bank a fire for overnight, and watch her do it until she got it right or failed trying. She failed a lot. The first time she tried to carry water from the pump to the cabin, she spilled half of it before she made it to the door. Gideon watched her make 3 trips when one should have been enough, then showed her how to distribute the weight, how to use her legs instead of her arms. "Again," he said. She did it again, and again, until her shoulders burned and her hands cramped and she wanted to throw the bucket at his head. But she learned. When she tried to cook, she burned the beans black and smoked out the cabin so badly they had to eat outside. Gideon scraped the pot clean without comment and handed it back to her. "What did you do wrong?" he asked. "Too much heat. Didn't stir enough." So I'll do it different next time." "Then there's no problem." It was maddening, his refusal to coddle her, but it was also freeing in a way she hadn't expected. He didn't get angry when she failed, didn't criticize or mock, just pointed out what went wrong and expected her to fix it, like she was capable, like there was no question she'd figure it out eventually. On the 8th day, he taught her to shoot. They walked to a clearing about a quarter mile from the cabin, and Gideon set up a target, a piece of wood with a circle burned into it. Then he handed her the rifle. "It's going to kick," he said. "Don't fight it. Let it happen." Eliza settled the stock against her shoulder the way he'd shown her, sighted down the barrel, and pulled the trigger. The rifle bucked hard enough to drive her back a step, and the shot went wide by at least 3 feet. "Again," Gideon said. By the time the sun was directly overhead, her shoulder was one massive bruise and she could barely lift her arms. But her last shot had hit the edge of the target circle, and Gideon had said, "Good enough." Coming from him, it felt like a victory. That night, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Eliza finally worked up the nerve to ask the question that had been sitting in her chest since she'd arrived. "Why did you send for a wife?" Gideon was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, seemed practical. "That's it? Practical? I'm getting older. Work up here is hard. Be harder when I can't do it alone anymore." He poked at the fire with a stick, watching sparks rise toward the dark ceiling. Seemed like having someone else made sense. Someone, not necessarily a wife. Wife means she stays. Partner means she can leave when it gets hard. Eliza absorbed that. What if she wants to leave anyway? Then she leaves. He looked at her then, his pale eyes reflecting firelight. "No one's keeping you here against your will, Eliza. You can walk down that mountain anytime you choose. And if I stay, then we figure out what that looks like." He stood, stretching. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow we check the traps." He left her sitting by the fire, and Eliza stared into the flames for a long time after. The truth was, she didn't want to leave. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Up here, no one was looking for her. No letters arrived. No lawyers knocked on the door. She was just Eliza, learning to survive, earning her place through work instead of trying to navigate the impossible maze of what men expected from women. It felt, for the first time in months, like she could breathe. But that feeling wouldn't last. 3 weeks into her time on the mountain, Eliza woke to find Gideon standing by the window, his whole body tense. "What is it?" she asked, sitting up. "Riders," he said. "2 of them, coming up the trail." Her blood went cold. "From town?" "No." He grabbed his rifle from its place by the door. "From lower down. They've been moving since before dawn." "How do you know?" "Because I saw their camp last night when I was hunting." He looked at her, and something in his expression made her stomach drop. "They're looking for something. Or someone." Eliza's hand started to shake. "It can't be. I was careful. I didn't—" "Get dressed," Gideon cut her off. "We don't have much time." She dressed in a blur, her fingers clumsy with fear. By the time she was decent, Gideon had already hidden most of the obvious signs of her presence. Her trunk shoved into a corner and covered with a tarp, her extra dress tucked away. "If they ask, you're my cousin," he said, "visiting from out east. You got sick. That's why you're up here recovering." Will they believe that? Probably not. But it's better than nothing. He moved to the door, then paused. "Eliza, whatever happens, don't run. Running makes you pray." She nodded, not trusting her voice. 20 minutes later, 2 men on horseback rode into the clearing in front of the cabin. They were well dressed for the mountain. Good boots, coats that cost more than Eliza had made in a month back in Philadelphia. One was older, with gray in his beard, and the look of a man who'd spent his life telling other people what to do. The other was younger, harder, with eyes that cataloged everything and gave nothing back. "Gideon Hale!" the older one called out. Gideon stepped onto the porch, rifle held casually, but not quite pointed at anyone. "That's me. Name's Morrison. This is my associate, Keller. We're looking for someone. A woman. A lot of women in the world. This particular woman came through Red Hollow about 3 weeks ago. Arrived on the supply wagon, left with a mountainman." Morrison smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That wouldn't be you, would it?" "Might be." "Mind if we ask her some questions?" "Depends on what kind of questions. The kind that determine whether she's here of her own free will or if she's been coerced." Gideon's expression didn't change. "She's here because she chose to be. That answer your question?" "I'm afraid we'll need to hear it from her directly." Before Gideon could respond, Eliza stepped onto the porch beside him. Her legs were shaking, but she kept her chin up and her voice steady. "I'm here by choice," she said. Morrison's eyes locked onto her, and she saw the recognition there. "Miss Crow, Mr. Halbrook has been very worried about you." "I'm sure he has. He's hired us to ensure your safe return to Philadelphia. There are legal matters that require your attention." "I have no legal matters with Mr. Halbrook." "That's not what his lawyers say." Keller spoke for the first time, his voice flat and professional. "They have documentation showing you entered into a contract." "I signed nothing," Eliza interrupted. "Whatever documents you have are forgeries." "That may be," Morrison said smoothly, "but that's a matter for the courts to decide. Our job is simply to escort you back so these matters can be resolved properly." "I'm not going anywhere." "Miss Crow, please be reasonable. We've come a long way." "So have I," Eliza said, "and I'm not going back." The temperature in the clearing seemed to drop 10 degrees. Morrison's pleasant expression hardened into something uglier. "Mr. Halbrook was very clear," he said. "You can come willingly or you can come unwillingly, but you will come." That's when Gideon shifted slightly, and the rifle that had been casual was suddenly very much not. "She said no," he said quietly. Morrison looked at him like he was a dog that had just growled unexpectedly. "You want to get involved in this? Really? She's standing on my porch. That makes me involved." "One rifle against 2 armed men," Keller said. "You want to think about those odds?" "I have." Gideon's voice was perfectly calm. "You're on a narrow trail, on a mountain you don't know, tracking someone who doesn't want to be found. Your horses are tired. You've got maybe 2 hours of daylight left, and you think you can take me, get her on a horse, and get down the mountain before dark?" Morrison's jaw tightened. "We have the law on our side." "No, you have a man with money on your side, not the same thing." Gideon jerked his chin toward the trail. "You should go. This isn't over," Morrison said. "No," Gideon agreed. "Probably not. But it's over for today." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Morrison yanked his horse's head around and started back down the trail, Keller following. They watched until the riders disappeared into the trees. Then Gideon lowered the rifle and let out a breath. "They'll be back," he said. Eliza knew he was right. She also knew that next time they'd come with more men, with better plans, with whatever it took. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I brought this to your door." Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at her, and his expression was serious but not angry. "You didn't bring anything I can't handle," he said, "but we need to talk, really talk, about who you're running from and what he wants. Because if we're going to fight this, I need to know what we're fighting." So Eliza told him everything. She told him about Victor Halbrook, about his obsession, about the way he'd systematically destroyed her life in Philadelphia when she wouldn't become his mistress. She told him about the forged documents, the lawyers, the way he'd twisted the law into a weapon to hunt her across 3 territories. Gideon listened without interrupting, his face giving nothing away. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mountain darkening into evening. "He'll come himself eventually," Gideon said. "Men like that always do. They can't stand someone telling them no." "I know. And when he does, it won't be about the law anymore. It'll be about making you an example." "I know that too." Gideon turned to look at her. "So we need to be ready. Really ready." He paused. "You willing to do whatever it takes?" Eliza met his eyes and didn't blink. "Yes. Even if it means crossing lines you never thought you'd cross?" She thought about the slap in Red Hollow, about the way violence had come so easily to her hand, about how far she'd already come from the woman she'd been in Philadelphia. "I'm already across those lines," she said. "I just need to know how far I'm willing to go." Gideon nodded slowly. "Then we start preparing. Tomorrow." That night, Eliza lay in the darkness and listened to the mountain settling around her. Outside, Gideon moved quietly under the overhang, checking his rifle, sharpening his knife. She'd come here to hide. But hiding was over now. Whatever came next, she'd face it standing. And if Victor Halbrook wanted her badly enough to follow her up this mountain, then she'd make sure he understood exactly what that choice cost him. The wind picked up, rattling the window frame. Somewhere in the distance, a cat screamed, high and piercing, like a woman in terror. Eliza closed her eyes and didn't flinch. She was done being prey. The next morning came too early and too cold. Eliza woke to frost on the inside of the window and Gideon already moving around outside, his breath making clouds in the pre-dawn air. She pulled on her coat and boots and stepped out to find him examining the ground near the tree line. "What are you looking for?" she asked. "Tracks. Want to know if they camped nearby or went all the way back down." He straightened, brushing dirt from his hands. "They went down. Means they weren't prepared to stay." "Is that good?" "Means they'll need supplies before they come back. Gives us time." He started toward the cabin. "Get the fire going. We've got work to do." Over breakfast, which Eliza managed not to burn this time, Gideon laid out his plan. It wasn't complicated, but it was thorough in the way everything he did was thorough. "First thing, you need to know this mountain better than they ever will. Every trail, every shortcut, every place where the ground gets unstable." He tapped the table with his finger. "You need to be able to move in the dark if you have to." "How long will that take?" "Weeks? Maybe a month? Depends on how fast you learn." "I'll learn fast." "Second, you need to be able to handle a rifle well enough to hit what you're aiming at. Not just sometimes. Every time." Eliza thought about her bruised shoulder, the way the rifle had felt like a living thing trying to escape her hands. "I can do that." "Third," he paused, his expression going harder. "You need to decide right now if you're willing to kill someone. Not in theory, in practice. Because if Halbrook comes up here with enough men, talking won't solve anything." The question hung in the air between them like smoke. Eliza wrapped her hands around her coffee cup and felt the heat seep into her palms. She thought about Victor Halbrook's smile, the way it never reached his eyes, the way he'd looked at her like she was something he'd already purchased and was just waiting for delivery. "Yes," she said. "If it comes to that, yes." Gideon studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. "All right then, finish eating. We start in 10 minutes." The first lesson was the mountain itself. Gideon took her up trails she hadn't known existed, through gaps in the rock that looked like nothing until you were standing right in front of them, across streams that would turn into torrents when the snow melted higher up. He showed her landmarks, a lightning-struck pine, a boulder shaped like a broken tooth, a cave entrance hidden behind a waterfall so thin it barely qualified as one. "You get turned around, you look for these," he said. "They'll get you home." "What if it's dark?" "Then you feel for them. Or you count steps. Or you remember which way the wind was blowing." He looked at her. "You'll figure it out when you need to." They walked for hours, until Eliza's legs were shaking and her lungs felt like they were trying to claw their way out of her chest. Gideon never slowed, never offered to stop, just kept moving with that same steady pace that seemed impossible to maintain, but somehow was. When they finally made it back to the cabin, the sun was already setting. "Tomorrow, we do it again," Gideon said. "Different trails." How many trails are there? Enough. He went inside and started building the fire. You should eat something, then sleep. Tomorrow's going to be harder. He wasn't lying. Over the next 2 weeks, Gideon pushed her harder than anyone had ever pushed her in her life. They hiked the mountain in every direction, in every kind of weather. Rain, wind, even an early snow that left 3 inches on the ground and made the trails slick as glass. He taught her to read the mountain's moods, how to tell when weather was coming by watching the clouds, how to know if a trail would hold or collapse under weight, how to spot the signs of predators. Bears leave claw marks on trees, he said, pointing to gouges in the bark 10 feet up a pine. Fresh ones mean they're active. Old ones just mean they were here once. What about cats? Cats don't leave signs, that's the point. He moved on without waiting for her to process that particular piece of information. The rifle practice was worse. Gideon was relentless about it, making her shoot until her shoulder was one massive bruise and her hand shook so badly she could barely hold the barrel steady. He set up targets at different distances, in different lights, from different positions. Again, he'd say, every time she missed. I hit it. You grazed it. Not good enough. Again. She wanted to throw the rifle at him, wanted to scream that she was trying, that she was doing her best, that maybe his best was just better than hers would ever be. But she didn't. She just reloaded and fired again. One afternoon, after she'd missed the same shot 5 times in a row, she finally lost it. I can't, she shouted, lowering the rifle. I'm doing everything you said, and I still can't hit it. Gideon was quiet for a moment, then he walked over and took the rifle from her hands. You're forcing it, trying to muscle the shot instead of letting it happen. I don't know what that means. Watch. He lifted the rifle in one smooth motion, barely seemed to aim, and fired. The target 50 yards away splintered in the center. See? That doesn't help me. You're thinking too much. Your body knows what to do. You just have to get out of its way. He handed the rifle back. Stop trying to control everything. Just breathe and shoot. Eliza wanted to argue, but something in his tone stopped her. She lifted the rifle again, closed her eyes for a second, took a breath, let it out slow, opened her eyes and fired without thinking about it. The bullet hit 2 inches from center. Better, Gideon said. Again. By the end of the second week, Eliza could hit a target at 75 yards 9 times out of 10. Her shoulder had developed a permanent ache, but she'd stopped flinching when she pulled the trigger. Stopped thinking about it. Just did it. Good enough, Gideon said finally, after she'd put 6 shots in a row through the center of a target he'd moved to 80 yards. Coming from him, it was practically a celebration. But the nights were harder than the days. After dinner, when the work was done and there was nothing left but the fire and the darkness pressing in around the cabin, Eliza's mind would start working, thinking about Morrison and Keller riding back up the mountain with more men, thinking about Victor Halbrook sitting in his Philadelphia office, moving pieces around a board she couldn't see. You're doing it again, Gideon said one night. Eliza looked up from the fire. Doing what? Thinking yourself into a corner. I can see it on your face. How do you know that's what I'm doing? Because I've done it enough times myself. He poked at the fire with a stick. Thinking won't change anything. All it does is wear you down before the fight even starts. So what am I supposed to do? Just not think about it? Think about what you can control. The rest is just noise. Eliza pulled her knees up to her chest. And what can I control? Whether you're ready when they come. Whether you panic or stay clear. He looked at her. Whether you give up or keep fighting. I won't give up. I know, but your mind doesn't know that yet. That's why it keeps circling. He stood and stretched. Get some sleep. Tomorrow we're doing night navigation. In the dark? That's generally when navigation at night happens, yes. Gideon, you need to know this mountain in the dark, Eliza, because when they might come at night. And I need to know you can move without light. His expression softened slightly. I won't let anything happen to you out there, but you need to learn. So she learned. Night navigation turned out to be exactly as terrifying as it sounded. Gideon took her up the mountain with only starlight to see by, then left her at a point half a mile from the cabin with instructions to find her way back. What if I can't? She asked, hating how small her voice sounded. Then you wait until morning and try again. But you won't need to. He handed her a small pouch. Matches in case you need to make a fire. Don't use them unless you have to." Then he was gone, melting into the darkness like he'd never been there at all. Eliza stood very still for a moment, listening to her heart hammer against her ribs. The mountain at night was a different creature entirely, full of sounds she couldn't identify, movements she couldn't see. Every shadow looked like something crouched and waiting. She made herself breathe, made herself remember what Gideon had taught her. The landmarks were still there, even if she couldn't see them clearly. The path was still under her feet. She just had to trust it. It took her 2 hours to make it back to the cabin, and she fell 3 times, scraped her hands raw on tree bark trying to find her way, and nearly walked straight into a ravine before she caught herself. But she made it. Gideon was sitting on the porch when she stumbled into the clearing. 2 hours, he said. Not bad for the first time. Eliza collapsed onto the porch steps, her whole body shaking. How long did it take you? 40 minutes? But I've been doing it for 20 years. He stood and went inside, came back with water. Drink. Then we'll talk about what went wrong. What went wrong is that I can't see in the dark. No one can, but you can learn to see enough. He sat down beside her. You relied too much on your eyes. Should have used your hands more, your feet. The mountain talks if you listen to it. The mountain tried to kill me. The mountain doesn't care about you one way or another. That's what makes it fair. He was quiet for a moment. You did good, Eliza. Better than I expected. She looked at him in the darkness. Why are you doing this? Really? You could have just told Morrison where to find me, could have stayed out of it. Gideon was silent for so long she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, had a sister once, younger than me. She got involved with a man who seemed decent enough at first. By the time we realized he wasn't, it was too late. He owned her. Not legally, but in every way that mattered. What happened? She tried to leave. He came after her. His voice went flat. I was in the mountains when it happened. Didn't even know until I came down 3 weeks later. Eliza felt something cold settle in her chest. Gideon, I don't need your sympathy. I'm just telling you why I know what men like Halbrook are. They don't see women as people. They see property. And property doesn't get to say no. He stood. So when Morrison rode up here and started talking about legal matters and contracts, I knew exactly what that meant, and I decided I was done watching men like that win. He went inside without another word, leaving Eliza sitting in the darkness. She understood him better after that, understood why he pushed so hard, why failure wasn't acceptable, why every lesson had to be learned right the first time or repeated until it was. He wasn't training her to survive, he was training her to win. 3 weeks after Morrison's visit, the weather turned. The temperature dropped 20 degrees overnight, and snow started falling in thick, heavy flakes that buried the clearing under 6 inches by noon. Gideon spent the morning reinforcing the cabin, checking the roof, stacking extra wood against the walls, making sure the shutters were sound. This is early, he said, frowning at the sky. Usually don't get snow like this until October. Is that bad? Means winter's coming hard. We'll need to lay in more supplies. He looked at her. You up for a trip to town? Eliza's stomach clenched. When? Tomorrow, if the snow stops. We go in, get what we need, get out. No lingering. What if Morrison's people are watching? Then we deal with it. He went back to checking the wood stack. Can't hide up here forever, Eliza. At some point we have to live. The snow stopped that night, leaving the world outside the cabin transformed into something clean and white and utterly silent. In the morning, they loaded the mule with furs Gideon had been saving and started down the mountain. The trip took longer than usual with the snow on the ground, but by mid-afternoon they were picking their way down the final stretch of trail into Red Hollow. The town looked smaller in the snow, hunched against the cold like something trying to disappear. They left the mule at the stable and walked to the general store. Gideon kept himself between Eliza and the street, his hand resting on his belt near his knife. A few people stared, but no one approached. Inside the store, the clerk, a thin man with nervous hands, looked up and immediately went pale. Mr. Hale, he said. Didn't expect to see you down here this soon. Need supplies. Gideon handed over a list he'd written that morning. Can you fill this? The clerk glanced at the list, then at Eliza, then back at the list. I can. But you should know there's been men asking about you, about both of you. Morrison? Him and others. They've been staying at the hotel, waiting. He lowered his voice. Word is they're planning something. Pritchard's been talking to them. Of course Pritchard was involved. The man whose face Eliza had slapped was exactly the type to hold a grudge and find ways to make it someone else's problem. When? Gideon asked. Don't know, but soon, I think. The clerk started gathering supplies from the shelves. I'd be careful if I were you. They loaded up the supplies in silence and were heading back toward the stable when Pritchard himself stepped out of the saloon. Well, well, he said, his hand going to his face where Eliza had hit him. The bruise was long gone, but the memory clearly wasn't. Look who decided to show their faces. Not looking for trouble, Pritchard, Gideon said. That's funny, because trouble's been looking for you. He gestured and two men stepped out behind him. Not Morrison or Keller, but cut from the same cloth. These gentlemen have some questions. We've got nothing to say. Now that's not very neighborly. Pritchard smiled. They just want to talk to your woman there. Make sure she's not being held against her will. I'm fine, Eliza said, keeping her voice level even though her heart was racing. I'm exactly where I want to be. One of the men, the taller one with a scar running from his eye to his jaw, stepped forward. Miss Crow, Mr. Halbrook just wants to know you're safe. He's very concerned. Mr. Halbrook knows exactly where I am and why I left. If he's concerned, he can be concerned from Philadelphia. That's not how this works, the scarred man said. You have obligations. I have nothing. Eliza took a step forward, and Gideon's hand on her arm stopped her. Tell Victor Halbrook that if he wants to talk to me, he can come up that mountain himself. Otherwise, this conversation is over. The temperature in the street dropped 10 degrees. The scarred man's expression went from polite to dangerous in the space of a heartbeat. You're making this harder than it needs to be, he said quietly. No, Gideon said. We're leaving. You can either let us or you can find out why that's a bad idea. For a moment, Eliza thought it was going to turn into a fight right there in the street. Then Pritchard laughed, breaking the tension. Let them go, he said. They're not going anywhere we can't find them. And when Mr. Halbrook gets here, he'll handle it proper. When? Eliza asked before she could stop herself. Pritchard's smile widened. Soon, sweetheart. Real soon. They walked back to the stable in silence, loaded the mule, and started up the mountain. Neither of them spoke until they were well away from town, and the trail had narrowed enough that they had to go single file. He's coming, Eliza said to Gideon's back. I know. What do we do? Gideon didn't stop walking, didn't turn around. We get ready, and then we end this. The climb back up the mountain felt twice as long as the climb down. Every shadow looked like someone following, every sound like footsteps. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was setting and Eliza's nerves were scraped raw. That night, Gideon laid out the reality of their situation. He'll come with enough men to make sure he wins, Gideon said, studying a rough map he'd drawn of the mountain. Probably 6, maybe 8. They'll try to box us in, cut off the trails. So what do? We don't let them box us in. He tapped a point on the map, a narrow pass about a mile north of the cabin. There's a section here where the trail runs under a granite shelf. Rock's unstable, been that way for years. Eliza looked at the map, then at him. You want to collapse it. If we can get them into that section, yes, would take out most of them in one go. And the ones it doesn't take out, we deal with them. He met her eyes. It's not a clean plan, Eliza, but clean doesn't work against men like Halbrook. She thought about that, about deliberately causing a rock slide, about the men who would be caught in it, about the line between self-defense and something darker. How do we get them into that section? She asked. Gideon's expression shifted into something that might have been approval. We make them think they've got us cornered. Let them follow us up the mountain. Let them think they're winning. Then we lead them right into the trap. That means I have to run. That means we both have to run. And make it look convincing. He paused. Can you do that? Eliza thought about Philadelphia, about running from Victor Halbrook's lawyers, his investigators, his web of influence that had followed her across 3 territories. She'd been running for months. Yes, she said, I can run. Good, because we'll only get one chance at this. They spent the next week preparing. Gideon showed her exactly where to place the charges, barrels of black powder he'd been saving for clearing stumps, positioned under the weakest parts of the granite shelf. They practiced the route they'd take, timing it so they'd have enough lead to get clear, but not so much that Halbrook's men would give up the chase. The trick is making them angry enough to stop thinking, Gideon said. Angry men make mistakes. How do we make them angry? He looked at her. That's easy. You've already done it. On the 8th day after their trip to town, fresh tracks appeared in the snow. Gideon found them at first light, coming up the main trail in a line that spoke of organization and purpose. He counted the prints, 8 horses, 9 men. When he came back to the cabin, his expression was grim. Today, he said. Eliza's stomach turned over, but her hands stayed steady. How long? Few hours. Maybe less. He started gathering supplies, rope, ammunition, the small pack he'd prepared with food and water. Get dressed warm. We're going to be moving fast. She dressed in layers, thick wool under her coat, her boots laced tight. The rifle went across her back, the knife Gideon had given her tucked into her belt. When she looked in the small mirror by the bed, she barely recognized herself. The woman staring back looked harder, leaner, ready. Eliza, Gideon said from the doorway. Whatever happens today, you stay alive. You hear me? Nothing else matters. What about you? I'll be fine. Done this kind of thing before. He handed her a small compass. If we get separated, you head due east. There's another cabin about 5 miles that way. Old Trapper's place. You wait there. I'm not leaving you. You will if I tell you to. His voice was hard. This isn't about being brave, Eliza. It's about surviving. Promise me. She wanted to argue. Wanted to tell him they'd make it through together or not at all. But the look in his eyes stopped her. I promise, she said. An hour later, they heard the horses. Gideon put out the fire, scattered the ashes, and checked the loads in his rifle one final time. Then he looked at Eliza and nodded. They left through this back window, the one Gideon had loosened weeks ago specifically for this purpose, and moved into the trees just as the first riders came into view of the cabin. From their position 30 yards upslope, Eliza could see them clearly. Morrison and Keller were there, along with 6 other men who had the look of people who got paid to be dangerous. And in the middle of the group, sitting straight-backed on a black horse, was Victor Halbrook. He looked exactly as she remembered, tall, well-dressed, even in traveling clothes, his face carrying that expression of entitled patience that said he'd never had to wait for anything in his life and didn't plan to start now. Gideon Hale, Morrison called out. We know you're here. Make this easy on yourself. Silence from the cabin. Morrison gestured, and 2 of the men dismounted. They approached the cabin with rifles ready, kicked in the door, searched the interior. One came back out shaking his head. They ran, Keller said. Halbrook's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. Then we follow. I didn't come all this way to be cheated by a mountain man and a stubborn woman. His voice carried clearly in the cold air, and Eliza felt something sharp and hot spike through her chest. Hearing him speak, being this close, after months of running, it made everything real in a way it hadn't been before. Easy, Gideon whispered beside her. Not yet. They waited until Halbrook's men had found their tracks and started following. Then they moved. Up the mountain, taking the route they'd practiced, leaving clear signs for angry men to follow. They heard shouting behind them. Someone had spotted movement. The chase was on. Eliza ran like she'd been running all her life, her breath coming hard in the thin air, her legs burning. Behind her, she could hear horses, men shouting, the crack of rifles firing warning shots. Gideon stayed close, guiding her up through the trees, across streams, over rocks. Keep going, he urged. They're gaining, but we're close. They burst out of this tree line into the narrow pass, and Eliza saw what Gideon had been talking about. Above them, a massive shelf of granite jutted out over the trail, held in place by rock that looked more like gravel than solid stone. Below it, the trail narrowed to barely 6 feet wide, with a drop-off on one side that fell away into nothing. Through the pass, Gideon said. Run! They sprinted through the choke point, and Eliza heard the moment Halbrook's men reached it behind them, the horses' hooves changing tone as they hit different stone, the way sound compressed in the narrow space. On the far side, Gideon grabbed her arm and pulled her behind a boulder. He was already pulling out the firing mechanism for the powder charges, a simple fuse that ran back under the granite shelf. Cover your ears, he said. Then he lit it. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Eliza could hear her heart beating, could hear the riders entering the pass, could hear Victor Halbrook's voice calling out orders. Then the world turned into thunder. The explosion ripped through the granite shelf with a sound like the mountain screaming. Rock shattered, powder smoke billowed, and tons of stone came crashing down into the pass. Eliza pressed her hands over her ears and squeezed her eyes shut against the dust cloud that rolled over their position. When the sound finally stopped, the silence that followed was somehow worse. Slowly, Eliza opened her eyes. Where the pass had been, there was now a wall of broken granite and twisted earth. Nothing living could have survived under that. Nothing. She stood on shaking legs and looked at Gideon. His face was grim, covered in dust, but his eyes were clear. "Is it done?" she whispered. "I don't know," he said. "We need to check." They approached the rock slide carefully, climbing over smaller debris to get a view of what had happened. The pass was completely blocked. That much was certain. But as the dust cleared, Eliza saw movement on the far side. 2 horses. 2 riders. One was Keller, looking shaken but alive. The other was Victor Halbrook. He sat perfectly still on his horse, staring at the rock slide like he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. Then, slowly, his head turned until he was looking directly at where Eliza stood. Even from 100 yards away, even through the settling dust, she could see the cold fury in his eyes. "Eliza!" His voice carried across the rubble. "This isn't over." Gideon's hand settled on her shoulder. "Come on, we need to move." But Eliza couldn't look away from Victor Halbrook's face, from the man who'd chased her across 3 territories, who'd twisted the law into a weapon, who'd sent men to their deaths rather than accept that she wasn't his to claim. "No," she said quietly. "It ends here." Gideon's grip tightened on her shoulder. "Eliza, we need to go. Now." But she couldn't move. Couldn't tear her eyes away from Victor Halbrook's face across the rubble. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the wall of broken granite between them, but the fury in his expression was anything but small. "You think this changes anything?" Halbrook shouted. His voice cracked slightly, the first time Eliza had ever heard anything less than perfect control from him. "You think you can murder my men and walk away?" "They're not dead," Keller called out, and Eliza's stomach dropped. "I can hear them. They're trapped, but they're alive." Halbrook dismounted, his movements sharp and precise. "Eliza, listen to me very carefully. You have one chance to end this without making it worse. Come down here. Now. We'll discuss this like reasonable people." "There's nothing to discuss," she said, surprised her voice came out steady. "There's everything to discuss. You've committed crimes, destruction of property, attempted murder, conspiracy. But I'm willing to overlook all of that if you just stop this madness and come home. Home." The word tasted like poison. "I am home," Eliza said. Halbrook's expression shifted into something colder. "Then you've chosen poorly. Keller, go back to town. Bring the sheriff. Bring witnesses. Bring whoever you need. I want this documented properly." Keller hesitated. "Mr. Halbrook, the men will survive until we can get equipment up here to move the rock. Go." Keller turned his horse and disappeared back down the trail. Halbrook stayed where he was, standing perfectly still, his eyes never leaving Eliza. "I can wait," he called out. "I've waited this long. A few more hours won't matter." Gideon pulled Eliza back from the edge. "He's stalling, giving Keller time to bring reinforcements." "I know. So we leave. Circle around, get back to the cabin, gather what we can carry, and head for the high country. He can't follow us up there, not without someone who knows the terrain." Eliza looked at him. "And then what? We hide for the rest of our lives? Wait for winter to kill us? Or wait for him to find us in spring? We survive. That's what." "No." She shook her head. "I'm done surviving, Gideon. I'm done running." She looked back at the rock slide. "There has to be another way." "There isn't. Not one that doesn't end with you in chains or worse." "What about the men under the rocks? If they're really alive, then they're Halbrook's problem, not ours." Gideon's voice was hard. "You didn't make him come up here. You didn't make him bring armed men to drag you back. This is on him." Eliza knew he was right, knew that everything that had happened was a direct result of Victor Halbrook's refusal to accept that she wasn't his to claim. But the knowledge didn't make it easier, didn't erase the sound of the explosion or the image of all that rock coming down. She'd killed men. Maybe. Probably. The thought should have horrified her more than it did. "We need to move," Gideon said again. "Standing here won't change anything. This time, Eliza followed him. They moved back into the trees, taking a route that would bring them around the rock slide and down toward the cabin from a different angle. Gideon set a brutal pace, and Eliza's legs were screaming by the time they stopped to catch their breath. "How long before Keller gets back with help?" she asked. "Depends on whether the sheriff's in town. Could be 3 hours, could be 6. He checked the position of the sun, which was already starting its slide toward the western peaks. "We've got until dark, maybe. After that, it gets complicated." "What do we do about Halbrook?" "Nothing. He's stuck on the other side of the rock slide with no way through. By the time they clear enough rock to get horses through, we'll be long gone. Unless he finds another route." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "There's one other trail that goes around the slide. It's bad, narrow, unstable. Most people don't know about it, but if he's got someone with him who knows the mountain, he doesn't. All his men are from out east. Then we're fine. Come on." They made it back to the cabin just as the sun was setting. Everything was exactly as they'd left it. The scattered ashes in the fireplace, the window still open in the back. Gideon went straight to work, packing supplies into 2 rucksacks with practiced efficiency. "Take only what you can carry," he said. "Food, warm clothes, ammunition. Everything else stays." Eliza grabbed her extra dress, the money she'd saved from her work in Denver before she'd fled to Red Hollow, the small knife Gideon had given her. Looking around the cabin, she felt a strange sense of loss. She'd only been here for weeks, but it had started to feel like something real, like a place she belonged. "Don't," Gideon said, watching her face. "Don't get attached. It's just a building. It's more than that. Right now it's a trap. That's all." He finished packing and slung one of the rucksacks over his shoulder. "We'll come back when this is over. If we can." If. They left through the front door this time. No point in hiding when Halbrook already knew where they'd been. The clearing was dark and quiet, the only sound the wind moving through the pines. They'd made it maybe 50 yards when Eliza heard it. A voice, calling her name. She stopped so suddenly that Gideon almost ran into her. "What?" he started. Then he heard it too. "Eliza!" The voice was coming from the direction of the rock slide. Male, but not Halbrook's. Younger. Panicked. "Eliza, please. We need help." Gideon grabbed her arm. "Keep walking." "Someone's hurt." "Not our problem." "Gideon, I said keep walking." His voice was iron. "It's a trap or it's bait. Either way, we don't take it." The voice called out again, more desperate this time. "My leg's crushed. Please, I can't feel it anymore. Just get someone. Anyone." Eliza felt something twist in her chest. What if it's real? Then he chose to follow Halbrook up this mountain, and he gets to live with that choice. Gideon pulled her forward. "Move." They walked for another 10 minutes, the voice gradually fading behind them. Eliza tried not to think about it, tried not to imagine someone trapped under all that rock, slowly freezing in the mountain night, tried not to remember that whoever was under there, they were human. They made camp in a small cave Gideon knew about, 2 miles from the cabin and well off any established trail. He didn't allow a fire, too visible, so they ate cold rations and wrapped themselves in blankets against the dropping temperature. "Get some sleep," Gideon said. "I'll take first watch." "I won't be able to sleep." "Try anyway. Tomorrow's going to be worse." Eliza lay down on this hard stone and closed her eyes, but sleep felt impossible. Her mind kept circling back to the rock slide, to the voice calling for help, to Victor Halbrook's face when he'd told her this wasn't over. He was right. It wasn't over. Not as long as he was still alive and still looking for her. The thought came unbidden, and it shocked her how easily she'd accepted it. A month ago, the idea of killing someone would have made her physically ill. Now it just felt like a problem that needed solving. What had the mountain done to her? Or maybe the question was, what had Victor Halbrook done to her back in Philadelphia when he decided she was his? Maybe this version of herself, hard, calculating, willing to do whatever it took, had always been there, just waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. She must have fallen asleep eventually, because the next thing she knew, Gideon was shaking her awake. The cave entrance showed the gray light of pre-dawn. "What is it?" she whispered. "Someone's coming. 2 people, on foot, moving careful." Eliza grabbed her rifle and followed him to the cave entrance. In the dim light, she could just make out 2 figures picking their way up the trail below them. As they got closer, she recognized Keller's distinctive way of moving, efficient, military. The person with him was smaller. A woman. Who's that? Eliza breathed. Gideon squinted. Can't tell, but they're tracking us. See how they're reading the ground? He was right. Keller would stop every few yards, examine the trail, then adjust his heading. They were following the exact route Eliza and Gideon had taken the night before. How? Eliza asked. We were careful. Not careful enough, apparently. Or Keller's better than I gave him credit for. Gideon pulled back from the entrance. We need to move, now. If they're this close, Halbrook's probably not far behind with whoever else Keller brought from town. They packed in silence and slipped out the back of the cave, taking a route that led higher up the mountain. The air got thinner, the temperature colder. Snow that had melted lower down was still thick up here, and within an hour Eliza's feet were numb inside her boots. Where are we going? She asked when they stopped to catch their breath. There's a series of old mining camps up this way, abandoned for 20 years, but the structures are still standing. We can hole up there, see if Keller's willing to follow us this high. And if he is? Gideon's expression was grim. Then we see how good he is in close quarters. They climbed for another 2 hours before Gideon called a halt. Below them, moving like ants against the snow, were 4 figures. Keller and the woman were in front. Behind them came 2 men on horseback. One was definitely Victor Halbrook, sitting straight-backed even on the rough terrain. The other, Eliza didn't recognize. Persistent bastard, Gideon muttered. Thought the horses wouldn't make it up the bad trail. What now? He studied the terrain ahead of them, his eyes calculating. See that ridge line? About a mile up? There's a cabin just beyond it. We get there first. We've got the high ground and good cover. They try to come at us. We pick them off one at a time. You're talking about a siege. I'm talking about survival. They've got numbers. We've got position. He looked at her. Unless you've got a better idea. Eliza looked down at the 4 figures below. Victor Halbrook had come all this way, had brought armed men, had paid off half of Red Hollow, had chased her across territories and up a mountain that was actively trying to kill everyone on it, all because she'd said no. We could go to them, she said slowly, under a white flag. Try to talk. Talking time is over, Eliza. You saw his face at the rock slide. I know, but what if... She stopped. What if what? What if she could reason with a man who'd never listened to reason in his life? What if she could make him understand that she'd rather die on this mountain than go back to Philadelphia with him? He already knew that, and he didn't care. Forget it, she said. You're right, the cabin. They climbed. The mining cabin, when they reached it, was barely standing. 3 walls of weathered wood, a roof that was more holes than shingles, and a stone fireplace that had collapsed into rubble. But it had one critical advantage. It sat at the top of a narrow approach where anyone coming up would be exposed for 100 yards. Gideon immediately set to work creating firing positions, stacking rocks to give them cover while maintaining clear lines of sight. Eliza checked her ammunition, 15 rounds for the rifle, plus what Gideon had in his pack. Not enough for a prolonged fight, but enough to make anyone think twice about charging their position. They'll wait until dark, Gideon said, settling behind his improvised barricade. Try to get close without us seeing them. So what do? We wait, and when they come, we make them pay for every foot. The afternoon stretched out long and cold. Eliza watched the figures below set up their own camp in a sheltered spot about 400 yards down the slope. They were clearly visible but well out of rifle range. Every so often, one of them would look up at the cabin, and even from this distance, Eliza could feel the weight of their attention. The woman with Keller, Eliza said. Who do you think she is? Tracker, maybe. Or someone who knows the mountain. Gideon shifted behind his barricade. Doesn't matter. She's helping Halbrook. That makes her the enemy. Enemy. Such a simple word for something so complicated. A month ago, Eliza's enemies had been bad weather and insufficient wages. Now they were people. Real people, with faces and names and lives that she might have to end to preserve her own. When had the line gotten so blurred? Gideon, she said quietly, what happens if we win? If we drive them off or kill them? What then? Then you're free. Am I? Halbrook's got money, connections. Even if he's dead, someone will come asking questions. The law, his family, someone. Let them come. They'll have to prove something happened, and proving something on a mountain where accidents happen all the time is harder than people think. He glanced at her. You having second thoughts? No? Just first thoughts about what comes after. Worry about after when after gets here. Right now, stay focused on staying alive. The sun started its descent toward the western peaks, painting the snow in shades of orange and red. Beautiful, if you could forget about the men with guns waiting for darkness. As the shadows lengthened, Keller and one of the other men started up the slope. They weren't being subtle about it, walking openly, hands visible and empty. When they got to about 50 yards out, Keller called up. "We want to talk!" Gideon raised his rifle but didn't fire. "So talk! Mr. Halbrook wants to make you an offer, a generous one." "Not interested. You haven't heard it yet." Keller took another step forward, and Gideon fired a shot that kicked up snow 2 feet in front of him. Keller stopped. "All right, I'm listening." Miss Crow comes down peacefully. Answer some questions about what happened to Mr. Halbrook's men. If she's been coerced, if there are circumstances that explain her actions, he's willing to be understanding. Eliza laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "Understanding? That's rich. It's the best offer you're going to get," Keller called back. "Alternative is we wait you out. You can't have much food up there. Water's frozen. Eventually you'll have to come down." "We'll take our chances," Gideon said. "And what about the men trapped under the rock slide? One of them's still alive, you know, been calling for help since yesterday. How long before that stops being attempted murder and becomes actual murder?" Eliza felt ice slide through her veins. "You're lying. Come down and see for yourself, or stay up there and let him die. Your choice." Keller gestured to the man beside him. "This is Sheriff Porter from Red Hollow. He's got some questions about the explosion, about whether it was an accident or something else." The sheriff was a heavy man with a thick beard and the kind of face that looked permanently skeptical. "Miss Crow, I'm going to need you to come with me. There's been serious allegations made." "Allegations by the man who's been chasing me across 3 territories," Eliza called back. "Who's been using forged documents and bought lawyers to try to drag me back to Philadelphia. You really going to take his word over mine?" "I'm going to take evidence. And right now the evidence says you and Mr. Hale here set a trap that killed or injured 7 men. They were armed. They were hunting me." "That's for a court to decide." The sheriff took a step forward, and Gideon's warning shot stopped him too. "You're not helping your case any by shooting at a lawman." "You're not a lawman up here," Gideon said. "You're just another man working for Halbrook's money." "That's a serious accusation." "Prove me wrong. Walk away. Tell Halbrook you're not willing to die on a mountain for his hurt pride." Porter's expression darkened. "We're not the ones in danger here, Mr. Hale. You are. Both of you. Best thing you can do is surrender now before this gets any worse." "It's already as bad as it gets," Gideon said. "Now get off my mountain before I make it worse." Keller and the sheriff exchanged a look. Then they started backing down the slope, hands still visible. When they were back at Halbrook's camp, Eliza let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "They'll come tonight," Gideon said. "That was just softening us up, seeing if we'd break." "We didn't break." "No, but they know we're committed now. Means they'll be committed too." He checked his rifle again. "Get some rest if you can. I'll keep watch." Rest felt impossible, but Eliza tried anyway. She curled up behind the barricade and closed her eyes, listening to the wind howl around the broken cabin. Somewhere in the distance, she heard what might have been a wolf, or might have been her imagination. She must have drifted off because the next thing she knew, Gideon was shaking her awake and the world was full dark. "They're moving," he whispered. Eliza grabbed her rifle and peered over the barricade. At first she couldn't see anything, just shadows and starlight on snow. Then movement caught her eye. Someone was crawling up the slope using the terrain for cover. "How many?" she breathed. "Can't tell, at least 2. Maybe more on the flanks." A rifle shot cracked the night, and splinters exploded from the cabin wall 3 feet above Eliza's head. She ducked instinctively, her heart hammering. "Return fire," Gideon said calmly. "Aim for muzzle flashes." Eliza raised her rifle, found a shadow that looked darker than the others, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against her shoulder, and somewhere down the slope someone cursed. The next 10 minutes were chaos. Gunfire lit up the darkness, the sound echoing off the mountains. Eliza fired, reloaded, fired again. She had no idea if she was hitting anything, just kept shooting at shapes and sounds and the brief flares of return fire. Then suddenly it stopped. The silence after all that noise felt like something physical. "They're pulling back," Gideon said. "Reloading or regrouping?" Eliza's hands were shaking as she reloaded her own rifle. "Did we hit anyone?" "Don't know, but we made it expensive for them." "That's what matters." They waited in the dark, every muscle tensed for the next assault. It came 20 minutes later, this time from a different angle. Someone had circled around while they were distracted, was now firing from their flank where the cabin wall provided less cover. "I've got this side," Gideon said. "You watch the front." Eliza shifted position, her eyes straining against the darkness. She saw movement, fired, missed, fired again. This time she heard someone cry out, a sharp pain sound that made her stomach turn. She'd hit someone, really hit them. There was no time to process that. More muzzle flashes from the front, bullets punching through the rotten wood of the cabin. Eliza returned fire until her rifle clicked empty, then scrambled to reload with fingers that felt too thick and clumsy. "Gideon," she shouted, "I'm out of ammunition. Here." He tossed her his backup pouch and she caught it one-handed. 20 more rounds. Maybe enough. Maybe not. The assault lasted another 5 minutes before Halbrook's men pulled back again. This time Eliza could hear arguing from down the slope, voices raised in anger and what might have been fear. "They're scared," Gideon said, listening. "Good. Scared men make mistakes. Or they get desperate. That too." Dawn came slowly, painting the sky in shades of gray and pink. When there was enough light to see clearly, Eliza looked down the slope and felt her breath catch. One man lay motionless in the snow about 40 yards out, a dark stain spreading around him. Another was being helped back to camp by Keller, his leg dragging. She'd done that. She and Gideon together. Below, in Halbrook's camp, there was movement. The remaining men were gathering, and Eliza could see the woman tracker pointing at something. A route, maybe. A different angle of approach. Then Victor Halbrook himself stepped forward. Even from this distance, even after a night of fighting, he looked perfectly composed. He looked up at the cabin, and Eliza knew he was looking directly at her. "Eliza Crow," his voice carried clearly in the still morning air. "I'm giving you one last chance. Come down. Face the consequences of your actions, or I will burn you out of that cabin and drag you down this mountain in chains." "You're welcome to try," Eliza shouted back, and was surprised by how steady her voice sounded. Halbrook stared up at her for a long moment. Then he turned to Keller and said something Eliza couldn't hear. Keller nodded and started giving orders to the other men. "What are they doing?" Eliza asked. Gideon was watching through the rifle's sights. "Getting ready to rush us, all of them at once. Overwhelming force." "Can we hold? Against 4 men with military training and nothing to lose?" He looked at her. "No, not for long." "So what do we do?" Gideon lowered the rifle and looked around the cabin, his expression thoughtful. "We make them regret it, and then we run." He started moving, gathering the remaining ammunition, checking their supplies. "There's a back way out of here, narrow trail that leads higher up. They probably don't know about it. And we just leave? Let them think they won? We live to fight another day. That's winning enough." He grabbed her arm. "Eliza, listen to me. You can't let pride kill you. I know you want to stand your ground, make him pay, but dead is still dead, no matter how righteous you were." She knew he was right, hated that he was right, but standing here and dying just to prove a point wouldn't change anything. "All right," she said. "We run." They gathered what they could carry and made their way to the back of the cabin. Gideon showed her the trail, barely visible, more of a goat path than anything human should be using. Goes up about half a mile, then cuts back east. Comes out near that waterfall I showed you, remember? Eliza nodded. "Good. I'll go last, cover our retreat. You get up there and don't look back. Gideon, go." She went. Behind her, she heard Halbrook's men start their assault. Heard Gideon's rifle firing 3 quick shots. Heard shouting, cursing, the sounds of men dying or trying not to. The trail was treacherous, covered in ice and steep enough that Eliza had to use her hands to pull herself up in places. Her lungs burned, her legs screamed, but she kept climbing. A gunshot cracked behind her, closer than the others. She looked back and saw Gideon scrambling up the trail, blood running down his left arm. "Keep moving," he shouted. Eliza kept moving. 20 more yards. 30. The trail leveled out slightly, and she risked another glance back. 3 men were on the trail below them, Keller in the lead, moving with professional efficiency. Behind him, the sheriff and another man Eliza didn't recognize. And at the bottom, staring up with an expression of pure fury, was Victor Halbrook. Eliza raised her rifle and fired without thinking. The shot went wide, but it made Keller duck and lose his footing. He slid back 10 feet before catching himself. "Go!" Gideon was beside her now, his face pale from blood loss. "The waterfall's just ahead. We can lose them there." They ran. The waterfall came into view, a thin sheet of ice this time of year, barely flowing. Behind it was the cave entrance Gideon had mentioned, hidden unless you knew exactly where to look. They ducked inside just as another shot rang out, chipping rock near Eliza's head. The cave went back about 30 feet, then narrowed to a crack barely wide enough to squeeze through. Gideon went first, and Eliza heard him grunt in pain as he pulled himself through. Then it was her turn. She got stuck halfway, her coat catching on something. Behind her, she heard voices at the cave entrance. Heard Keller say, "They went in here." Panic gave her strength. She wrenched herself forward, felt fabric tear, and suddenly she was through. On the other side was a larger cavern, lit by a crack in the ceiling that let in weak daylight. Gideon was already at the far end, examining another way out. "Can they follow?" Eliza asked. "If they're skinny enough and desperate enough." He grimaced, clutching his wounded arm. "We need to keep moving. You need to stop bleeding first. Later, right now." A sound from behind them cut him off. Someone was in the narrow passage, grunting with effort as they squeezed through. Gideon raised his rifle one-handed, braced it against a rock. "Get behind me." Eliza moved, but kept her own rifle ready. The sound of scraping got closer, and then a figure emerged into the cavern. It was the woman tracker. She was younger than Eliza had expected, maybe 30, with dark hair and eyes that took in the situation instantly. "Don't shoot," she said, her hands coming up slowly. "I'm not armed." "Then you're stupid," Gideon said, but he didn't lower the rifle. "What do you want?" "To talk, just for a minute." She kept her hands visible, her movements careful. "My name's Sarah Tanner. I'm a guide from Denver. Halbrook hired me to track you." "Congratulations, you found us." "I did. And now I'm telling you there's another way out of this that doesn't end with everyone dead." "I'm listening," Eliza said. Sarah's eyes shifted to her. "The man under the rock slide. Morrison. He's alive, but he's hurt bad. Crushed leg, probably internal injuries. He needs a doctor, needs one soon, or he's going to die." "And that's my problem how?" "It becomes your problem when the sheriff charges you with murder. Right now, it's attempted at worst. But if Morrison dies," she shook her head, "Halbrook's got enough money to make sure you hang for it, both of you." "Unless," Gideon prompted, "unless you help get him out. Show Keller and the others how to move the rock safely. Prove it was self-defense, that you weren't trying to kill anyone." Sarah took a step closer. "Look, I don't know what Halbrook did to you, but I know what I've seen the last 2 days. That man's obsessed. He's not going to stop until you're dead or he's got you back in Philadelphia. So why are you helping us?" "Because I'm not getting paid enough to watch people die for one man's pride." She lowered her hand slightly. "And because Morrison's got a wife and 2 kids back in Denver. They don't deserve to lose him because Halbrook can't take no for an answer." Eliza looked at Gideon. His expression was unreadable, but she could see him thinking, calculating odds. "It's a trap," he said quietly. "Maybe," Eliza said. "Or maybe it's a way out that doesn't end with more blood. You go back there. Halbrook will never let you leave." "Then I don't go back there. I send you." She met Sarah's eyes. "You can guide him, right? Show him where the unstable rock is, how to move it safely?" Sarah nodded slowly. "I can do that. And while you're doing that, I talk to the sheriff. Tell him everything. About Philadelphia, about the forged documents, about why I ran." Eliza's hands tightened on her rifle. "Make Halbrook defend himself for once instead of me." "Eliza, it's the only way, Gideon. If Morrison dies, none of this matters. We'll be murderers. But if we save him, if we can prove we were just defending ourselves, you're gambling with your life. I've been gambling with my life since Philadelphia. At least this way I might actually win." Gideon stared at her for a long moment. Then he lowered his rifle and turned to Sarah. "You double-cross us, I'll hunt you down," he said flatly. "Understood." Sarah looked at Eliza. You sure about this? Eliza wasn't sure about anything, but she was tired of running, tired of looking over her shoulder, tired of being the prey in someone else's hunt. I'm sure, she said. And with those words, everything changed. The walk back down the mountain felt longer than any climb Eliza had made. Sarah led the way, moving with the confidence of someone who'd spent her life reading terrain. Gideon followed behind Eliza, his rifle ready, despite the blood still seeping through the makeshift bandage she'd tied around his arm. You're going to need stitches, Eliza said over her shoulder. I've had worse. That doesn't make it better. Wasn't trying to make it better, just stating a fact. He paused to catch his breath, his face pale. You really think this is going to work? I think it's the only chance we've got that doesn't end with one of us dead. Sarah glanced back. The sheriff's not a bad man. He's just bought, Eliza finished. I know the type. Halbrook's good at finding them. Maybe. But Porter's got a reputation for being fair, even if he is taking Halbrook's money. If you can give him a reason to doubt Halbrook's version of things, that's a lot of ifs. Better than no chance at all. Sarah stopped at a fork in the trail. This way. We'll come at the rock slide from above, see what we're dealing with before we commit. They moved in silence after that, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Eliza's mind kept circling back to the moment she'd have to face Victor Halbrook again. She'd been running from that moment for months, and now she was walking straight into it. The difference was, this time she wasn't running. They smelled the rock slide before they saw it, dust and crushed stone and something else, something worse. Sarah held up a hand, and they all stopped. Wait here, she said. Let me scout it first. She disappeared into the trees, moving so quietly Eliza couldn't hear her footsteps. Gideon lowered himself onto a boulder, his breathing labored. You all right? Eliza asked. No, but I'll live. He looked at her, his pale eyes serious. You don't have to do this. We can still run. Get to the high country before anyone knows we're gone. And then what? Spend the rest of our lives hiding? Some people would call that winning. I'm not some people. Eliza sat down beside him. I'm tired, Gideon. Tired of being afraid, tired of letting Victor Halbrook control my life even when he's hundreds of miles away. He's not hundreds of miles away anymore. I know. That's why this has to end here. Sarah reappeared so suddenly, Eliza jumped. Morrison's alive. Barely. They've got him partially dug out, but there's a boulder pinning his leg. They're afraid to move it without equipment. How many men with him? Gideon asked. 3. Keller, one of Halbrook's hired guns who looks half dead himself, and someone I don't recognize, probably from town. She paused. Halbrook and the sheriff are camped about 100 yards down from the slide. Halbrook's pacing like a caged animal. Good, Eliza said. Let him pace. They made their way to the rock slide carefully, approaching from above where they could see the full scope of the destruction. The granite shelf had come down exactly as Gideon had planned, blocking the entire pass with tons of broken rock. But in one section, Eliza could see where Keller's men had been digging, a small opening where Morrison's arm was visible, moving weakly. Keller saw them first. His hand went to his gun, then stopped when he saw Sarah. Tanner, where the hell have you been? Finding them. Sarah gestured to Eliza and Gideon. They're willing to help, but we need to talk terms first. Terms? Keller's voice was flat. They caused this. They don't get to negotiate. Actually, they do. Sarah's voice was calm but firm. Because without their help, Morrison dies. That boulder's sitting on a fulcrum. Move it wrong, the whole thing shifts and crushes him completely. Move it right, he might have a chance. Keller looked at Gideon. And you know how to move it right? I know this mountain, know how rock settles after an explosion. Gideon stepped closer, studying the pile. That boulder there, see how it's resting against the smaller ones? Those are the key. Pull them out in the right order, the big one shifts back instead of forward. And if you're wrong, then Morrison dies and you've got one more body to dig out. Gideon met his eyes. But I'm not wrong. The standoff lasted maybe 10 seconds. Then Keller stepped back. All right, show me. What followed was 2 hours of the most delicate, nerve-wracking work Eliza had ever witnessed. Gideon directed from the side, his voice calm despite the pain he had to be in, telling Keller and the other men exactly which rocks to move and in what order. Sarah helped, her smaller hands able to reach places the men couldn't. Eliza stood guard, her rifle ready in case this was all an elaborate trap. But as the minutes turned into hours and Morrison's agonized moans got louder as they shifted weight off his crushed leg, she started to believe they might actually pull this off. "Last one," Gideon said finally. "The flat stone under the left side of the boulder. Pull it straight out. Don't angle it." Keller wrapped a rope around the stone and braced himself. "On 3. 1, 2, 3. The stone came free, and for a heart-stopping moment the boulder teetered. Then it rolled backward, away from Morrison, and crashed into the pile behind it with a sound like thunder. Morrison screamed, a raw sound that echoed off the mountain. But he was free. Keller and Sarah pulled him out of the hole, and Eliza got her first good look at the damage. Morrison's leg was crushed from the knee down, bent at an angle that made her stomach turn. His face was gray, his breathing shallow. "He needs a doctor," Sarah said. "Now, or he's going to die anyway." "Closest doctor's in Red Hollow," Keller said. 3 hours down with a horse, 6 on foot. He won't make it. He might if we stabilize him first." Gideon moved closer, examining Morrison's leg with a practiced eye. "Need to splint it, stop the bleeding. Got any laudanum?" "Some." Keller pulled a small bottle from his coat. "Not much. It'll have to do." Gideon looked at Eliza. "I need straight branches about this long." He held his hands 2 feet apart. "Strong enough to hold weight." Eliza found what he needed in the pine grove nearby, cutting branches with her knife while her hands shook. When she came back, Gideon was already tearing strips from Morrison's own shirt to use as bandages. The splinting took another 20 minutes. Morrison passed out halfway through, which Eliza figured was a mercy. When Gideon finally sat back, his own face was nearly as gray as Morrison's. "That's the best I can do," he said. "Rest is up to how tough he is." "He's tough enough," Keller said quietly. Then he looked at Eliza. "I suppose you'll want something for this. Your cooperation." "I want to talk to the sheriff, that's all." "About what?" "About the truth. About why we're up on this mountain in the first place." Eliza met his eyes. "About who Victor Holbrook really is and what he's been doing." Keller was quiet for a moment. "He's not going to like that." "I don't care what he likes. I'm done caring about what Victor Holbrook wants." Something shifted in Keller's expression. Not quite respect, but maybe understanding. "All right, I'll take you down to their camp, but the rifle stays here." "No." "Eliza," Gideon started. "No," she said again more firmly. "I go down there unarmed. I'm prey again. I'm done being prey." Keller studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Keep it. But if you point it at the sheriff, this ends badly for everyone." "I'm not planning to point it at anyone who doesn't give me a reason to." They left Morrison in Sarah's care and started down toward Holbrook's camp. Gideon walked beside Eliza, his wounded arm held tight against his body. "You sure about this?" he asked quietly. "No, but I'm doing it anyway." "That's either very brave or very stupid." "Can it be both?" He almost smiled. "I suppose it can." The camp came into view through the trees, 2 tents, a fire that had burned down to coals, and 3 men. The sheriff sat on a log, cleaning his rifle. One of Holbrook's remaining hired men stood guard, his hand resting on his gun. And Victor Holbrook himself stood with his back to them, staring up at the mountain like he could will it to give him what he wanted. He turned when he heard them approach, and for the first time in months, Eliza looked directly into his eyes. He looked different than she remembered. Thinner, harder. The journey up the mountain had stripped away some of the polish that usually cloaked him, but the eyes were the same, cold, calculating, entitled. "Eliza," he said, and her name in his mouth still made her skin crawl. "I knew you'd see reason eventually. I'm not here because I saw reason. I'm here because a man's dying, and I'm not going to let you make me into a murderer. You did that yourself when you set that trap. I set a trap to defend myself against armed men who were hunting me. There's a difference. The law might not see it that way. Then let's ask the law." Eliza turned to Sheriff Porter. "I want to make a statement, a full accounting of everything that's happened, starting in Philadelphia." Porter glanced at Holbrook, then back to Eliza. "I'm listening." "She's a liar," Holbrook cut in smoothly. "Unstable, prone to flights of fancy. I have documentation proving—" "Your documentation is forged," Eliza interrupted. "Every single piece of it. The contract you claim I signed? I never saw it until your lawyers showed up in Denver. The debt you say I owe? Fabricated to give you legal cover for hunting me down. You have proof of this? I have my word. And I have witnesses who saw what really happened in Philadelphia. She looked at Halbrook. Tell him about Mrs. Hendricks, the boarding house owner who told me you'd paid her to evict me. Tell him about James Carver at the textile factory who fired me after you told him I was a thief. Halbrook's expression didn't change. I did those things for your own good, Eliza. You were making poor choices, associating with the wrong people. I was trying to protect you. Protect me? You were trying to own me. Eliza's voice shook, but she didn't stop. You decided I was going to be your mistress. And when I said no, you made it impossible for me to survive in Philadelphia. You isolated me, destroyed my reputation, made sure I had nowhere to turn. I offered you a life of comfort, of security. You offered me a cage. And this, Halbrook gestured at the mountain, at her torn clothes and bleeding hands. This is better? Living like an animal with a man who can barely speak in complete sentences? Yes, Eliza said simply, because it's mine, my choice, my life. Porter had been listening quietly, his expression unreadable. Now he spoke up. Mr. Halbrook, you got these documents on you? The ones proving your legal claim? Halbrook hesitated for just a fraction of a second, but Eliza saw it. So did the sheriff. They're in my attorney's possession in Philadelphia. I can have them sent. You brought lawyers with you up this mountain, Porter said. Where are they? The silence stretched out. Finally, Keller spoke up from behind Eliza. Morrison was his attorney, the one under the rock. He had all the documents with him. So let's see them, Porter said. They're buried under tons of granite, Halbrook snapped, along with Morrison himself, who you people nearly killed. We didn't nearly kill him. We saved him. Eliza took a step forward. And if those documents are so important, why did you let your attorney carry them into a dangerous situation? Why not leave them safe in town? Because I needed them to prove my case to local authorities who might not understand the complexity of the legal situation. Or because they don't exist. Eliza looked at Porter. Sheriff, I'm asking you to send a telegram to Philadelphia, to the courthouse there. Ask about Victor Halbrook's legal claim against Eliza Crow. Ask if there's any record of a contract, a debt, anything. That could take weeks, Halbrook said. Then we wait weeks. Eliza's voice was steel. I'm not going anywhere. Porter stood slowly, his bulk making the movement deliberate. Mr. Halbrook, I gotta say, this is starting to smell funny to me. You hired a tracker, hired guns, chased this woman up a mountain, got several men killed or injured, and now you can't produce the documents that supposedly justify all of it. Sheriff, I'm paying you. You're paying me to enforce the law, not to help you kidnap a woman who doesn't want to go with you. Porter turned to Eliza. Miss Crow, you're free to go, for now. But you stay in the territory, you understand? If there's charges to be filed after we sort this out, I need to know where to find you. I'll be on the mountain, Eliza said. Same place I've been. Halbrook's face went from composed to furious in the span of a heartbeat. This is absurd. You're letting her manipulate you. Can't you see that? She's a criminal. She nearly killed my men. Your men who were hunting her with guns, Porter interrupted. Last I checked, a person's got a right to defend themselves. Now, you want to file charges about the rock slide. We can talk about that. But this other business, the debt, the contract, that needs to be proved before I'm willing to enforce it. I'll have your badge for this. You're welcome to try. Porter's voice went hard. But in the meantime, I'd suggest you get your injured man down to a doctor and think real careful about your next move. For a long moment, Eliza thought Halbrook was going to do something reckless. His hand twitched toward the gun at his belt, his jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscles jumping. But then Keller stepped between them. Mr. Halbrook, he said quietly, Morrison needs to get to town. We can deal with the rest of this later. The spell broke. Halbrook turned away, his shoulders rigid with barely controlled rage. Get him ready to move. We leave within the hour. As Keller and the others started breaking camp, Eliza felt Gideon's hand on her shoulder. We should go, he said quietly, before he changes his mind about letting you walk away. But before they could move, Halbrook turned back one more time. This isn't over, Eliza. You know that, don't you? His voice was soft, almost conversational. I've spent months hunting you. I've spent a fortune. Do you really think I'm going to just walk away because some territorial sheriff got squeamish? I think you don't have a choice. There's always a choice, and I choose to keep fighting until I get what I want. He smiled, and it was the coldest thing Eliza had ever seen. See you soon. The walk back up the mountain was silent. Sarah had already left with Morrison and the others, helping carry the wounded man down the treacherous trail. That left just Eliza and Gideon, moving through the lengthening shadows as the sun started its descent. They were almost back to the cabin when Gideon finally spoke. You know he meant it, about not being over. I know. So what do we do? Eliza thought about that. About Victor Halbrook's face when Porter had told him no. About the way he'd looked at her, not like a person, but like property that had temporarily escaped his control. We prove he's a liar, she said. Get statements from Philadelphia, from everyone who saw what he did to me there. Build a case so solid that even his money can't buy his way out of it. That could take months. Then it takes months. She stopped walking and turned to face him. I'm not running anymore, Gideon. If he wants a fight, he'll get one. But it's going to be on my terms, not his. Gideon studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, then we better get ready, because a man like Halbrook doesn't lose quietly. They reached the cabin as the last light was fading from the sky. Everything was exactly as they'd left it, scattered, abandoned in their hurry to escape. Eliza stood in the doorway, looking at the simple room that had become more home to her in a few weeks than anywhere she'd lived in years. Think he'll try again? She asked. Yes, but not right away. He'll wait for Morrison to recover or not. See if there's criminal charges. Try to rebuild his case. Gideon moved past her into the cabin, started gathering the scattered supplies. Gives us time to build ours. How? We start with the sheriff. Get him to send that telegram to Philadelphia. Then we find people who'll testify about what Halbrook did there. Your landlord, your employer, anyone who saw him harass you. They were all on his payroll. Some of them, maybe, but not all. There's always someone who didn't take the money or didn't get offered enough. He lit a candle, the warm glow pushing back the darkness. We just have to find them. Eliza thought about Mrs. Hendricks, the boarding house owner who'd apologized when she evicted her. About James Carver, who'd looked sick when he fired her. About the other women at the textile factory who'd known something was wrong, but had been too scared to speak up. Maybe some of them would talk now. Maybe enough time had passed that Halbrook's influence had faded. Or maybe she was fooling herself, and they'd all stay silent out of fear or loyalty or simple self-preservation. But she had to try. All right, she said. Tomorrow, we go back to town. Talk to Porter. Start the process. Tonight you rest. That arm needs proper cleaning, and you look like you're about to fall over. He wasn't wrong. Now that the adrenaline was fading, Eliza could feel every bruise, every scrape, every mile she'd run in the last 2 days. Her whole body ached with a deep, bone-tired exhaustion. Gideon heated water while Eliza collapsed into one of the chairs. When the water was warm enough, he brought it over along with clean cloth and the whiskey he kept for emergencies. This is going to hurt, he said, examining the cuts on her hands. Everything hurts already. This won't be worse. He cleaned her hands with a gentleness that surprised her, his rough fingers careful around the damaged skin. When he poured whiskey on the deeper cuts, she hissed but didn't pull away. Your turn, she said when he was done. Gideon's wound was worse than she'd thought, a deep gash that ran from his elbow halfway to his shoulder, still seeping despite the makeshift bandage. She cleaned it as carefully as he'd cleaned hers, then used needle and thread to close the worst of it. You've done this before, Gideon observed, watching her work. Had to learn when I was working at the factory. Machines didn't care if you were paying attention or not. Seems you've had to learn a lot of things the hard way. Only way I know. She tied off the last stitch and wrapped his arm in clean bandages. There. Try not to use it for a few days. Can't promise that. Then try not to use it for a few hours. This time he did smile, brief and genuine. I can probably manage that. They ate a cold dinner. Neither of them had the energy for cooking and sat by the fire in silence. Outside, the mountain settled into night, and somewhere in the distance a wolf howled its lonely song. What you did today, Gideon said eventually, standing up to Halbrook like that. A lot of people wouldn't have had the spine. I didn't have a choice. You always have a choice. You could have run, could have let Morrison die and disappeared into the high country like I suggested. And lived the rest of my life looking over my shoulder? No thanks. Eliza stared into the fire. I'm tired of being afraid, tired of letting him have power over me. He still has power, money, connections, the will to keep fighting. I know, but I've got something he doesn't. What's that? Nothing left to lose. She looked at Gideon. He can't threaten me with poverty. I've already got nothing. Can't threaten me with isolation. I've already left everyone I knew behind. Can't threaten me with violence. I've already survived his hired guns and a mountain that tried to kill me. He can threaten you with prison, with hanging, if he pushes the murder charges. Then I'll fight that too. Eliza's voice was quiet but certain. I'm done running, Gideon. Whatever comes next, I face it standing. Gideon was silent for a long moment, his pale eyes reflecting firelight. Then he stood and moved to the shelf where he kept his few books. He pulled one out, old, leather-bound, the pages soft with age, and handed it to her. What's this? My sister's journal. She kept it the last year she was alive when she was trying to leave the man who... He stopped, started again. When she was trying to leave. Eliza opened it carefully. The handwriting inside was small and precise, the words raw and honest. She read a few lines and felt something twist in her chest. Why are you showing me this? Because she wrote in there about the day she decided to stop fighting, the day she decided it was easier to go back to him than to keep running. His voice was rough. I found it after she died. Read it cover to cover trying to understand why she gave up. Gideon, you remind me of her. Same stubbornness, same fire. But you've got something she didn't. He met her eyes. You've got someone willing to stand beside you instead of behind you. Someone who sees you as an equal, not as property to be protected or controlled. Eliza's throat went tight. Is that what you see when you look at me? An equal? What else would you be? It was such a simple question, asked so matter-of-factly, that for a moment Eliza couldn't speak. In Philadelphia, in Denver, in every place she'd lived before this mountain, she'd been less than. Less smart, less capable, less worthy of respect. The world had told her that in 1,000 small ways every single day. But Gideon had never seen her as less than anything. From the moment she'd climbed up this mountain on shaking legs, he'd expected her to be capable. Expected her to learn, to grow, to match him step for step. And somehow, impossibly, she had. Thank you, she said finally, for teaching me, for standing with me, for seeing me. Nothing to thank me for. You did the work. Still, she handed the journal back. I won't give up. I promise you that. I know you won't. He returned the journal to its shelf. That's why I'm not worried. That night, lying in the darkness and listening to Gideon's quiet breathing from his bedroll by the fire, Eliza thought about everything that had happened, about the woman who'd stepped off that wagon in Red Hollow, exhausted and desperate and so afraid. That woman was gone. Not erased, exactly, but transformed by everything the mountain had demanded of her. The woman who'd slapped Pritchard in the street had been all rage and no direction. The woman who'd climbed these trails had been all determination and no skill. But the woman lying here now, she was something different, something harder and clearer and more certain of who she was and what she deserved. Victor Halbrook might come back. Probably would come back, with more lawyers and more guns and more money to throw at the problem of Eliza Crow refusing to be owned. But this time when he came, he wouldn't be fighting someone who was running. He'd be fighting someone who'd learned to stand her ground. And that, Eliza thought, as sleep finally pulled her under, made all the difference. Morning came with frost on the windows and a clarity Eliza hadn't felt in months. She woke to find Gideon already up, his wounded arm moving stiffly as he rebuilt the fire. How's it feel? She asked. Like I got shot, but it'll hold. He glanced at her. We're going to town today. You ready for that? As ready as I'll ever be. They ate quickly, packed light, and started down the mountain while the sun was still low on the horizon. The trail looked different in daylight, less threatening, more familiar. Eliza found herself noticing things she'd missed in her panic 2 days ago. The way certain trees grew bent from prevailing winds, The places where game trails crossed the main path, the sound of water running beneath snow. The mountain was teaching her, still. Maybe it always would. Red Hollow looked smaller than she remembered, hunched under gray clouds that threatened snow. They left the mule at the stable and walked to the sheriff's office, a squat building that smelled like old coffee and wood smoke. Sheriff Porter looked up when they entered, his expression unreadable. "Didn't expect to see you two back so soon." "We need to talk," Eliza said, "about getting those telegrams sent to Philadelphia." Porter leaned back in his chair, making it creak. "Already sent one yesterday, soon as we got Morrison down to the doctor." "What did you say?" "Asked about any legal claims filed by Victor Halbrook against Eliza Crow. Asked about contracts, debts, anything on the public record." He pulled out a piece of paper. "Also asked about Halbrook himself, his business dealings, his reputation." Eliza felt something loosen in her chest. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Might be nothing comes of it. Might be Halbrook's got everything locked down tight back there." He paused. "But I got to say, something about his story doesn't sit right. Man comes all this way, brings armed men, nearly gets people killed, all for a woman who owes him money? That doesn't track." "It's not about money," Eliza said quietly. "It never was. Figured as much." Porter stood and moved to the window, looking out at the street. "Morrison's alive, by the way. Doctor says he'll lose the leg, but he'll live. Asking to talk to you, actually." "Why?" "Said he's got things to say. About Halbrook. About the documents he was carrying." Porter turned back to face her. "You interested in hearing them?" Eliza looked at Gideon, who nodded slightly. "Yes. Where is he?" "Doctor's office, 2 buildings down." "But Eliza—" Porter's voice went serious. "Whatever he tells you, we're going to need it official. Written down, witnessed. Otherwise, it's just talk." "I understand." Morrison looked like death warmed over. He lay in a narrow bed in the doctor's back room, his face the color of old paper, his eyes sunken. The space where his right leg should have been was wrapped in bandages that were already seeping through. He saw Eliza and tried to sit up, failed, fell back against the pillow. "Miss Crow," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I hoped you'd come." Eliza pulled up a chair. Gideon stayed by the door, watchful. "The sheriff said you wanted to talk." "I wanted to apologize." Morrison's eyes were wet. "For everything, for hunting you, for believing Halbrook's lies." "What lies?" "All of them." He coughed, and the doctor's assistant appeared with water. When he could speak again, Morrison continued. "The contract doesn't exist, never did. I wrote it myself, backdated it, forged your signature based on samples Halbrook provided from letters you'd written him." The room went very still. Eliza heard her heart beating in her ears. "Why?" she managed. "Because he paid me. A lot of money to create legal documents that would give him the right to bring you back. Said you were unstable, that you'd fled debts and needed to be returned to Philadelphia for your own good." Morrison's laugh was bitter. "I believed him at first, or maybe I just wanted to believe him because the money was good." "What changed? Watching him these last few days? The way he talks about you, the way his face looks when he says your name." Morrison met her eyes. "That's not a man trying to help someone. That's a man who's lost control of something he thinks belongs to him." "Do you have proof?" "Of the forgery?" "Had. The originals were in my case, the one buried under the rock slide. But I can testify. Can write down everything I did, who paid me, when. Won't bring back my leg, but might keep you from losing your freedom." Eliza felt tears burn behind her eyes, but didn't let them fall. "Why are you doing this?" "Because I've got a wife, 2 daughters, and lying here thinking I might never see them again, all I could think about was what kind of man I'd become, what they'd think if they knew what I'd done." He shifted, wincing at the pain. "I can't undo it, but I can at least tell the truth." Porter took Morrison's statement that afternoon, writing it all down in careful script while the lawyer spoke in a voice that got weaker as the hours passed. When it was finished, Morrison signed it with a shaking hand, and 2 witnesses, the doctor and Sarah Tanner, who'd stayed in town, added their names. "This is good," Porter said, reading it over. "Real good. But it's still your word against Halbrook's. He'll say Morrison was coerced, that he's lying to save himself from criminal charges." "Then we need more," Eliza said. "We need people from Philadelphia to corroborate what Morrison's saying, people who saw what Halbrook did there." That'll take time. Weeks, maybe months. I've got time. What Eliza didn't say was that she was betting Halbrook didn't. He'd already spent months hunting her, already lost men and money and reputation. How much longer would he keep fighting before he cut his losses and went home? The answer came 3 days later. Eliza was at the cabin practicing her shooting while Gideon worked on reinforcing the door when they heard horses on the trail. Not many, just 2. They both grabbed their rifles and took up positions. But it wasn't Halbrook's men. It was Sarah Tanner and Keller, both looking grim. "We need to talk," Keller said from the edge of the clearing, his hands visible and empty. Gideon didn't lower his rifle. "So talk. Halbrook's planning something. We don't know what exactly, but he's been sending telegrams. Brought in someone from Denver, a lawyer. They've been holed up in the hotel for 2 days." "Why are you telling us this?" Eliza asked. Keller looked uncomfortable. "Because Morrison told me what he told you, about the forged documents, and because I've been doing this work long enough to know when a man crosses the line from righteous to obsessed." "Little late for a crisis of conscience," Gideon observed. "Maybe, but better late than never." Keller shifted his weight. "Look, I'm paid to do a job, but I'm not paid to help a man destroy an innocent woman just because she hurt his pride. Morrison might have taken Halbrook's money to forge documents, but I didn't know that when I signed on. Now I do." Sarah stepped forward. "There's more. The telegrams Halbrook's been sending, one of them went to a judge in Denver, a federal judge. He's trying to get a warrant issued claiming you're a fugitive who fled legal obligations." Eliza's stomach dropped. "Can he do that? If the judge doesn't look too closely at the evidence? Maybe. Federal warrant means federal marshals. Means this stops being a territorial matter and becomes something bigger. How long do we have? Week at most. Judge is supposed to arrive in Red Hollow to review the case personally. Halbrook's probably hoping the appearance of federal authority will be enough to force your surrender." Eliza looked at Gideon. His expression was thunderous. "We run," he said. "Get ahead of this before the marshals show up." "No." Eliza's voice was firm. "I'm done running. If Halbrook wants to bring a judge here, fine. Let him. We've got Morrison's testimony now. We've got proof. We've got the testimony of a man who already admitted to committing fraud," Keller pointed out. "Judge might not give it much weight. Then we get more. Porter sent those telegrams to Philadelphia days ago. Responses should be coming in soon. And if they don't support your story, then I guess I'll find out what federal prison looks like." Eliza set her rifle down. "But I'm not running anymore. Not from Halbrook, not from the law, not from anyone." The judge arrived 6 days later, accompanied by 2 federal marshals and enough official documentation to sink a ship. His name was Thurston Webb, and he looked like a man who'd spent his entire life disappointed by other people's moral failures. The hearing was set for the town hall, such as it was, a drafty building that usually hosted dances and the occasional town meeting. Halbrook sat at one table with his newly arrived lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Cordell. Eliza sat at another with Gideon beside her and Sheriff Porter standing nearby. Judge Webb called the proceedings to order with a gavel that sounded like a gunshot. "We're here to examine the allegations made by Mr. Victor Halbrook regarding Miss Eliza Crow and her flight from legal obligations in Philadelphia." Webb looked at Halbrook. "Mr. Cordell, present your evidence." Cordell stood, smooth and professional. "Your Honor, Mr. Halbrook has documentation showing that Miss Crow entered into a contract for employment and housing, that she failed to fulfill the terms of that contract, and that she fled Philadelphia owing substantial debts. We ask that she be remanded to custody and returned to Philadelphia to answer these charges." "And the documentation?" "Was unfortunately lost when Miss Crow and her accomplice deliberately caused a rock slide that killed several men and buried Mr. Halbrook's attorney, who was carrying the originals." "Convenient," Webb observed dryly. "You have copies?" "We're working on obtaining them from Philadelphia, but in the meantime, we have Mr. Halbrook's sworn testimony about the contents of these documents." "I see. And Miss Crow, do you have representation?" Eliza stood. "I'm representing myself, Your Honor." Webb's eyebrows went up. "Bold choice. You understand the charges against you?" "I understand them, and I deny them completely. There was no contract, there are no debts. Mr. Halbrook has been pursuing me because I refused to become his mistress, and he's using the law as a weapon to force my compliance." Halbrook shot to his feet. That's absurd. I was only trying to help. Mr. Halbrook, sit down. Webb's voice cracked like a whip. You'll have your chance to speak. He looked at Eliza. That's a serious accusation, Miss Crow. Can you prove it? I can, Your Honor. Eliza's hands were shaking, but her voice stayed level. I have the sworn testimony of Mr. Morrison, who admits to forging the contract documents on Mr. Halbrook's behalf. I have telegrams from Philadelphia corroborating my account of Mr. Halbrook's harassment there, and I have witnesses who can testify to what happened on this mountain. I'll hear the testimony first. Morrison was carried in on a stretcher, still pale but conscious. He told his story again, slower this time, with the details about dates and payments and exactly how he'd created the fraudulent documents. Cordell tried to discredit him, suggesting he was lying to avoid charges for the rockslide deaths, but Morrison held firm. I'm a dead man anyway, he said quietly. Infections set in. Doctor gives me maybe a week. I've got nothing to gain from lying now except maybe a clean conscience. Next came the telegrams. Porter read them aloud. Responses from Eliza's former landlord, from other boarders at the house, from women who'd worked with her at the textile factory. All of them told the same story. Victor Halbrook had fixated on Eliza, had used his influence to isolate her, had made it impossible for her to stay in Philadelphia. He told me if I didn't evict her, he'd see that my other properties were condemned, Mrs. Hendricks had written. I was ashamed to do it, but I had 6 other families depending on those buildings. I chose their welfare over hers, and I've regretted it ever since. By the time Porter finished reading, Halbrook's face had gone from confident to ashen. Webb looked at him. Mr. Halbrook, these are serious allegations. Do you wish to respond? Halbrook stood slowly. For the first time since Eliza had known him, he looked uncertain. Your Honor, I may have been overzealous in my attempts to help Miss Crow, but my intentions were always honorable. She was making poor choices, associating with unsuitable people. I felt responsible for her welfare. Why? Webb asked bluntly. What was your relationship to her that made you feel this responsibility? Halbrook hesitated. I had hoped we might. He wanted me as his mistress, Eliza said clearly. When I refused, he decided to destroy my life until I had no choice but to accept his offer. That's not true. Then explain the forged documents. Explain why you paid Morrison to create false legal claims. Explain why you chased me across 3 territories with armed men. Eliza stood, facing him across the room. Explain why you couldn't just let me go. The silence in the hall was absolute. Everyone was staring at Halbrook, waiting for an answer that didn't come. Finally, Webb spoke. Mr. Halbrook, based on the evidence presented, I'm dismissing all charges against Miss Crow. Furthermore, I'm referring this matter to the district attorney for possible prosecution of fraud and abuse of legal process. He banged his gavel. This hearing is adjourned. Halbrook didn't move, just stood there, staring at Eliza like he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. It's over, she said quietly. You lost. For a moment she thought he might try something reckless. His hand twitched toward his coat, and the marshals immediately stepped forward, hands on their weapons. But then the fight seemed to drain out of him. His shoulders sagged, his face went blank, and he turned and walked out of the hall without another word. Eliza watched him go and felt nothing. Not triumph, not relief, not even satisfaction. Just a bone-deep exhaustion and the strange sensation of a weight she'd been carrying for so long finally lifting. You all right? Gideon asked beside her. I think so. Ask me again tomorrow. Porter came over, shaking his head. Never seen anything quite like that. Man had everything, money, lawyers, influence, and he threw it all away because he couldn't accept being told no. That's what men like him do, Eliza said. They mistake power for permission. Think the world owes them whatever they want. Well, the world just told him different. Porter held out his hand. You're free to go, Miss Crow. Officially. She shook his hand, feeling the calluses on his palm. Thank you, Sheriff, for listening. For doing the right thing even when it wasn't easy. Just doing my job. He tipped his hat to both of them and walked away. The crowd that had gathered for the hearing was dispersing, people talking in low voices about what they'd just witnessed. Eliza saw Pritchard in the back, the man she'd slapped that first day in Red Hollow. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then he nodded once, Not quite respect, but maybe acknowledgement, and left. What now? Gideon asked. Eliza thought about that. What did come now? She was free, really free, for the first time in months. No one hunting her, no legal threats hanging over her head, no reason to keep looking over her shoulder. Now we go home, she said. The walk back up the mountain felt different, lighter somehow, despite the fact that Eliza's legs were just as tired and the trail was just as steep. She found herself noticing things she'd been too stressed to see before. The way the late afternoon sun turned the snow gold, the tracks of animals crossing the path, the sound of wind through the pines. They stopped at the stream where Gideon had first let her rest on that initial climb, and Eliza knelt to drink. The water was just as cold, just as clean, but this time she savored it instead of gulping it down desperately. You're smiling, Gideon observed. Am I? First time I've seen it look natural. Eliza touched her face, surprised to find he was right. I guess I'm just realizing it's actually over. He's really gone. For now, man like Halbrook might try again once he licks his wounds. Let him try. I'll be ready. She stood brushing dirt from her skirt. And if he's smart, he'll realize I'm more trouble than I'm worth and move on to easier prey. You're definitely trouble, Gideon agreed, but there was warmth in his voice. They reached the cabin just as the sun was setting. Everything looked exactly as they'd left it, but somehow different too. Or maybe Eliza was the one who was different, and the cabin was just reflecting that change back at her. Inside, Gideon built up the fire while Eliza put together a proper meal. Not just cold rations or burned beans, but real food cooked with actual care. It was a small thing, but it felt important. A way of marking this moment, this transition from running to staying. They ate in comfortable silence and afterward sat by the fire with coffee that Gideon didn't ruin for once. So, he said eventually, you staying then? For real? Eliza looked at him, at his weathered face and pale eyes, and the careful way he held himself, like he was braced for disappointment. Is that what you want? Wouldn't ask if it wasn't. Then yes, I'm staying. She paused. If you'll have me, as an actual partner, not just because you need help with the work. Been treating you like a partner since day one. I know, but I'm saying it out loud now, making it official. She set down her coffee and turned to face him fully. I want to stay here, Gideon. Build something real with you, not because I'm running from something, but because this is where I choose to be. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but close. All right then, we'll need to make it legal eventually, if you're staying permanent, I mean. You asking me to marry you? I'm saying it's practical, property rights, legal standing, that sort of thing. He looked uncomfortable. But if you'd rather not, I'll marry you, Eliza said, when we're ready, when it's about us wanting to, not about needing to for legal protection. Fair enough. Gideon picked up his coffee again. For now, we've got winter coming. Need to lay in more supplies, reinforce the shutters, make sure we've got enough wood stacked. It was so completely typical of him, jumping from marriage proposals to winter preparations without missing a beat, that Eliza couldn't help but laugh. What? He asked. Nothing, just you're consistent, I'll give you that. Consistency's important on a mountain. It's important everywhere, I'm just not used to it. They sat in silence after that, watching the fire burn down. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the promise of snow. Winter was coming early this year, just like Gideon had predicted, but Eliza wasn't afraid of it anymore. Wasn't afraid of the cold, or the isolation, or the hard work that survival would demand. She'd learned enough now to know she could handle it. And more importantly, she wouldn't be handling it alone. Gideon, she said quietly, thank you for everything. For teaching me, for standing with me, for seeing me as worth the trouble. He looked at her, his expression serious. You were never trouble, Eliza. You were just a person who needed a chance to become who you were supposed to be. And who's that? Someone strong enough to claim what's hers instead of letting other people take it away. Eliza thought about that, about the woman who'd stepped off the wagon in Red Hollow, exhausted and desperate and running from a man who thought he owned her. That woman had been weak, not because she lacked courage, but because she'd never been given the chance to develop strength. But the mountain had given her that chance, had demanded she become strong or die trying. And Gideon had been there every step of the way, pushing her harder than anyone ever had, but never doubting she could rise to meet the challenge. "I couldn't have done this without you," she said. "Yes, you could have. Would have been harder, taken longer, but you'd have found a way." He stood and stretched. "You're the kind of person who doesn't know how to quit. Just took you a while to figure that out about yourself." He went to check the door one last time before bed, leaving Eliza alone with her thoughts. She looked around the cabin, at the simple furniture, the well-organized shelves, the rifle hanging by the door. It wasn't much by most people's standards. No luxury, no comfort, just the bare minimum needed for survival. But it was hers, earned through work and pain and refusal to give up. And that made it worth more than any mansion Victor Holbrook could have offered her. The next morning brought 6 inches of fresh snow and a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Eliza woke early, dressed warm, and went outside to find Gideon already clearing a path from the door to the woodpile. "Morning," she said. "Morning. Sleep well?" "Better than I have in months." She grabbed the second shovel. "What needs doing?" "Everything, but we've got time." They worked through the morning, falling into a rhythm that felt natural now. Gideon would start a task, and Eliza would follow his lead until she understood it, then work alongside him as an equal. No wasted motion, no wasted words, just 2 people building something together. Around noon, they took a break for food and coffee. Sitting on the porch, looking out at the snow-covered clearing, Eliza felt a peace she'd never experienced before. Not happiness, exactly. That seemed too simple for what she was feeling. More like rightness. Like all the pieces of her life had finally clicked into place. "You thinking about him?" Gideon asked. "Holbrook?" "No. Actually, I wasn't." "Good. Man doesn't deserve space in your head anymore." "What about you? You thinking about your sister?" Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes, but less now than I used to." "Why's that?" "Because you're here. Because I got a chance to do it right this time." He looked at her. "Couldn't save her, but I could help you save yourself." "We saved each other," Eliza corrected. "I gave you a reason to fight. You gave me the tools to win." "Maybe." He stood, brushing snow from his pants. "Come on. Want to show you something." He led her up the trail behind the cabin, following a path Eliza had noticed before but never explored. It switchbacked up through dense pine forest, finally opening onto a ridge that looked out over the entire valley. From here, Eliza could see Red Hollow in the distance, small and insignificant against the vast landscape. Could see the trails they'd fought over, the pass where the rockslide had happened, the peaks that marched away to the horizon in shades of white and gray. "This is where I come when I need to think," Gideon said. "Helps to see how small everything looks from up here. Puts problems in perspective." Eliza understood. From this height, Victor Holbrook's obsession looked like what it was. One small man's inability to accept rejection, meaningless in the grand scope of things. All that pain he'd caused, all that destruction, and from up here it was just a tiny ripple in an ocean of stone and sky. "It's beautiful," she said. "It's honest. Mountain doesn't lie to you, doesn't try to be something it's not. It just is. Like you." He smiled slightly. "Like both of us now." They stood there for a long time, watching clouds roll across the peaks and listening to the wind sing through the pines. Finally, Gideon spoke again. "You know what you want from this life, Eliza. Really want." She thought about that. A month ago, she would have said safety or freedom or just to be left alone, but those were all things defined by running away from something. Now she had the luxury of thinking about what she wanted to run toward. "I want to belong somewhere," she said finally. "Not because I was born there or because someone decided I should be there, but because I chose it. Because I earned my place through work and skill and refusal to quit." "You've got that here. I know. And I want to keep it, build on it, make this mountain as much mine as it is yours." "Already is. The mountain doesn't care about deeds or ownership. It only cares about who knows it well enough to survive it. Then I want to know it better, learn every trail, every seasonal change, every trick to making it through winter. I want to be good at this life, not just adequate." Gideon nodded slowly. "We can do that. Got decades of knowledge to share if you're willing to learn." "I'm willing." They walked back down to the cabin as the sun started its descent, and Eliza realized this was what home felt like. Not a place exactly, but a sense of belonging. of having earned your spot through effort and pain and stubborn refusal to give up. That evening, after dinner, Gideon pulled out a piece of paper and a pencil. "What's that for?" Eliza asked. "Making a list. Things we need from town before winter really sets in. Things we need to do to prepare." He started writing in his cramped handwriting. "Your input's good here. You're seeing things with fresh eyes that I might miss." So they made the list together, Eliza suggesting things she'd learned they needed, Gideon adding things from his experience. It was such a domestic scene, two people planning for winter like countless couples had done before them. But it felt revolutionary to Eliza. This was partnership. This was what she'd been denied her whole life, treated like someone whose thoughts and opinions mattered. 3 days later, they made another trip to Red Hollow. This time there was no tension, no fear of who they might encounter. Just two people coming down from the mountain to get supplies. The town's attitude toward Eliza had shifted noticeably. People nodded as she passed, some even saying good morning. The woman who'd been too afraid to speak to her that first day now asked how she was settling in. Pritchard stayed in his saloon and didn't come out. At the general store, the nervous clerk from before helped them load supplies without once asking if they were sure about their choices. He even threw in extra coffee, saying it was on the house. "Word got around about the hearing," he said quietly. "About what you did. Standing up to a man like Halbrook. A lot of people here respect that." "I just told the truth. That's more than most people would have done. Easier to stay quiet, keep your head down. Keeping my head down is what got me hunted across 3 territories. Speaking up is what set me free." The clerk nodded thoughtfully. "Good lesson for all of us, I suppose." On their way out of town, they passed the doctor's office. On impulse, Eliza went inside. Morrison was still there, weaker than before, the infection Gideon had predicted clearly taking its toll. "Miss Crow," he said when he saw her, "I heard about the hearing. I'm glad—" He coughed, the sound wet and painful. "I'm glad my testimony helped." "It did. More than you know." She sat beside the bed. "How are you feeling?" "Like a man who's about to meet his maker, but at least I'll do it with a clear conscience." He managed a weak smile. "That's worth something, isn't it?" "It's worth everything. Will you do me a favor? When I'm gone, will you write to my wife? Tell her I tried to do the right thing at the end." "I'll tell her. I promise." Morrison died 2 days later. Eliza kept her promise, writing a letter to his widow that detailed his final testimony and his role in freeing her from Halbrook's pursuit. She didn't mention the forgery, didn't mention his part in the persecution, just focused on the redemption, the courage it took to tell the truth when everything was already lost. Sometimes, Eliza was learning, mercy was more important than justice. Winter came in hard that year, just like Gideon had predicted. The snows were deep and the cold was brutal, and there were days when going outside for more than a few minutes risked frostbite. But the cabin held, their supplies lasted, and Eliza found herself not just surviving the mountain winter, but understanding it, learning to read its moods, to work with its rhythms instead of fighting against them. She got better with the rifle, better with the traps, better at judging weather and knowing when to push and when to hunker down. Gideon taught her to read tracks in snow, to process game, to make tools from what the mountain provided. Every skill she learned felt like another piece of armor, another layer of capability between her and helplessness. And in the quiet evenings by the fire, they talked, really talked about everything and nothing. Gideon told her about his childhood, about the sister he'd lost, about the years he'd spent on this mountain learning to live with solitude. Eliza told him about Philadelphia, about her family who died when she was young, about the dreams she'd had before Victor Halbrook had shattered them. "You ever regret it?" Gideon asked one night. "Answering my ad? Coming up here?" "Not once." "You?" "No. You're loud and you ask too many questions and you never do anything the easy way." "That sounds like regret." "It's not. It's just honest." He poked at the fire. "But you also work harder than anyone I've ever known, and you don't quit even when quitting would be smarter. And you made this cabin feel less like a tomb and more like a home." Eliza felt warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "That might be the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me. Probably says more about the people in your past than about what I just said." "Probably. But I'll take it anyway." Spring came eventually, the way it always did. The snow melted, the streams ran high, and the mountain transformed from white silence into something green and alive. Eliza and Gideon worked from dawn to dusk, repairing winter damage, planting a small garden, checking trap lines, and hunting trails. One afternoon in late April, Sarah Tanner rode up to the cabin with news. "Thought you'd want to know," she said, dismounting. "Halbrook left the territory. Took a train back to Philadelphia 2 weeks ago." "He give up?" Eliza asked. "More like the federal prosecutor gave him a choice: leave quietly or face charges for fraud and conspiracy. Turns out forging legal documents to pursue a woman across state lines is frowned upon, even if you're rich." Sarah smiled. "He chose leaving. Good riddance. There's more. The prosecutor's office sent letters to all his victims in Philadelphia, offering restitution if they're willing to testify about his pattern of harassment. Sounds like Miss Crow wasn't the only woman he did this to." Eliza felt something hard settle in her chest. How many others? At least 5 that they know about. Probably more who won't come forward. Sarah's expression was grim. "He's done, though. Even his money can't save him from that many accusations. His business partners are already distancing themselves." "So he really lost. Completely. And you won." Sarah held out her hand. "Congratulations, Eliza. You beat him." After Sarah left, Eliza stood in the clearing and looked up at the mountain rising behind the cabin. She'd come here broken, desperate, running from a man who thought he could own her. And the mountain had taken that broken woman and forged her into something harder, something capable, something free. Victor Halbrook had wanted to control her, to bend her to his will. Instead, he'd driven her to a place that taught her she didn't need his approval or anyone else's, that she could survive on her own strength, her own skill, her own stubborn refusal to accept defeat. "You all right?" Gideon asked from the porch. "Yeah, just thinking." "About?" "About how sometimes the worst thing that happens to you ends up being the best thing. If Halbrook hadn't chased me out of Philadelphia, I never would have found this place, never would have found you. Could argue you would have been safer staying in Philadelphia. Easier life, at least." "Safer isn't always better, and easier definitely isn't." She walked over to him. "I'd rather have a hard life that's mine than an easy one that belongs to someone else." "That's the mountain talking." "No, that's me talking. The mountain just taught me how to say it." They were married in June in a simple ceremony at the cabin with Sarah and Sheriff Porter as witnesses. No fancy dress, no elaborate celebration. Just 2 people choosing each other freely, without coercion or necessity or anything except the simple desire to build a life together. "You sure about this?" Gideon asked as they stood facing each other. "More sure than I've ever been about anything. Even though I'm old and cranky and set in my ways? Even though you're all those things, you're also honest and capable, and you see me as an equal. That's rare enough to be worth everything else." The vows were simple. They promised to stand beside each other, to share the work and the hardship and the occasional moment of peace. No flowery language about eternal devotion or undying love. Just practical promises between 2 practical people who knew that survival mattered more than sentiment. But when Gideon slipped a simple gold band onto Eliza's finger, one that had belonged to his mother, worn smooth by decades of mountain living, she felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For giving me a chance. For believing I was worth the effort. You gave yourself the chance. I just pointed you at the work." Maybe that was true. Maybe she'd saved herself, and Gideon had just been the catalyst. But Eliza didn't think it mattered who got credit. What mattered was that she was here, free, married to a man who respected her, living a life she'd chosen. That night, lying in the darkness and listening to the mountains settle around them, Eliza thought about the woman she'd been and the woman she'd become. The distance between them felt impossible, like they were 2 different people entirely. In a way they were. The woman who'd stepped off that wagon in Red Hollow had been defined by fear and desperation. The woman lying here now was defined by capability and choice. She'd earned every callus on her hands, every scar on her body, every piece of knowledge in her head, and no one could take that away from her. "You asleep?" Gideon asked quietly. "No, just thinking." "About?" "About how far I've come. About how different everything is now. Different good or different bad?" "Different good. So good it almost scares me." "Why?" "Because I'm not used to having things I don't want to lose." Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then his hand found hers in the darkness. "That's what makes it worth having." The fear of losing it means it matters. He was right. The old Eliza, the one from Philadelphia, had nothing to lose because she'd already lost everything that mattered. But this Eliza, the mountain Eliza, the free Eliza, she had everything: a home, a partner, a life that belonged to her. And if that made her vulnerable to loss, well, that was the price of having something real. "Gideon," she said softly. "Yeah." "I love you. I don't think I've said that out loud yet." "You haven't, but I knew anyway." "How?" "Because you stayed. And because you don't do anything halfway, Eliza Crow. When you choose something, you choose it completely." She smiled in the darkness. He was right about that too. She'd chosen this mountain, this life, this man, not because she had to, but because she wanted to, because for the first time in her life, she was strong enough to claim what she wanted instead of settling for what was offered. And that made all the difference. Years later, when people asked Eliza about her life on the mountain, she never told them about Victor Halbrook. Never talked about the chase, the rock slide, the courtroom confrontation. Those were just details, just events that had happened along the way. What she talked about was what came after: the work of building a life, the satisfaction of surviving each winter and greeting each spring, the quiet joy of partnership with someone who saw her as an equal, the feeling of belonging to a place not because she was born there, but because she'd earned it. She talked about the mountain like it was alive because in a way it was. It taught and tested and demanded everything from those who chose to live on its slopes. But it also gave back to those who learned its lessons. It gave strength, clarity, freedom. It gave her herself. And in the end, that was all Eliza Crow had ever really needed. Not rescue, not protection, not someone to solve her problems. Just a chance to discover who she was when no one was trying to tell her who she should be. The mountain gave her that chance, and she seized it with both hands and refused to let go. That was the story worth telling.